Okay, and Jake, Director Helene's now here, so I think we can get started. Thanks for rolling with us, everyone.
Do we start at the very beginning or just okay? Okay, thank you. So yes, Alana and Lisa and myself are here to provide a bit of an overview and introduction before we get into the actual detailed presentations that we've outlined here on the agenda. The ultimate background, of course, or context around these initiatives is tied directly to the broader housing crisis, which we are all very aware and familiar with. Which has its origins of, I would argue, in the last 3 to 4 decades at least, in which there's been a number of obvious factors that have contributed to that. Chief among them, in my mind, although I acknowledge there's many of them, include the federal government's very direct withdrawal from housing policy, investment, and strategy. The financialization or commodification of the housing sector, in which individuals and corporations have more and more utilized the housing sector as a means to both store and accumulate wealth. And in some cases, some rapid or definitely some strong population growth, which has challenged or increased demand on the existing supply of housing stock. There's many other issues, of course, though, but certainly we've talked with the board about these, and I think you're well versed in them, of course. The end result, in my simplistic view, is a clear decoupling of the ownership prices and rental rates from local income levels, and it's quite apparent, and the income or the impact is not being felt equally across the community. It's most impactful for those in the low income or the vulnerable population sectors, in which they are being placed in extreme financial hardship, precarious living situations, and in some cases, even worse, homelessness. So the board is aware of these issues, and we're not here today to focus on why it's occurred, but more what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to join others in trying to address these very complex issues that are impacting our community. So bringing ourselves a little bit further forward to the CVRD's regional growth strategy, which was developed and adopted around 13 years ago. At that time, home prices were approximately around $300,000 on average. And of course, that seems quite small in today's context. But even at that time, affordable housing was an issue. And both with rental rates and prices, we were facing similar impacts on individuals and families. We, of course, now have the issues have deepened even further with significant homelessness challenges in our community and many others, and there is not a cure-all solution for these. So like I said before, we are looking to collaborate, to partner, and to join others in trying to address these very complex and severe issues. So almost about a year ago today, pretty close at least, in May of 2023, you are called that the board met to consider the community's response and needs around a purpose-built supportive housing and shelter space. The board provided support to the City of Courtenay in their dialogue with the province and BC Housing around that issue, and also directed staff to come forward with information on the creation of a plan to provide a coordinated response to the housing crisis in the Comox Valley. This set the stage for the June 2023, as you see here on this slide, strategic planning session, in which our facilitator has spoke of already. To consider the response, and staff brought forward information both on the ARCs that make up that wheelhouse that you see there, and on some of the outcomes and work that has been achieved through your existing regulatory tools and investments with the homelessness support service and otherwise. Following discussion and debate, the board generally agreed that efforts and resources should be focused on the safety net and housing with supports ARCs of the wheelhouse, and this strategic interest was further sort of tapered, if I can use that word, to 3 things. One is establishing a vehicle for regional housing collaboration, coordination, advocacy, and development focused on the non-market rental housing aspect. 2 is advocating to the province for an emergency shelter housing. And 3 is continuing to support the Comox Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. If we fast forward just a little bit further from that June session to September of 2023, Staff then brought forward the service review that was conducted for the homelessness supports and emergency land acquisition services, as well as an interim report on our affordable housing supports. Amongst those findings, the two pieces of work that resulted in the board direction to undertake a homelessness needs assessment and community plan, and also to obtain advice on the potential establishment of a local government corporation to facilitate the creation of new non-market rental housing. So this direction and this refinement by the board over the course of last year has set the stage for today's session. And we're looking to build upon the CVRD's existing tools and investments and supports and partnerships for the creation of affordable and supportive housing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the next slide here. To Lisa, sorry.
So we thought we would just ground ourselves in all the work that is currently being done and has been done over the past year or two. AKA so much is happening out there already, in addition to the work that we're talking about today. So as many of you are aware, as well as your staff, the Bill 44 implementation, that significant piece of legislation that's moving through our communities. Our communities have also been successful in receiving the Housing Accelerator Fund. We have the regional housing needs assessment that is currently in draft and will be out in the community, and our communities are already using that data to help support the work that is being done, certainly in the market housing area of the wheelhouse. And then CVRD in particular has continued to support our homelessness support service allocations. We have current builds that are happening in the community right now. And this year you chose to move to supporting some of the immediate needs of our housing population or homelessness population. We're also working with the coalition, supporting them with their strategic plan. We had the wonderful announcement with the city of Courtenay on the BC housing Braidwood property. And then we've seen considerable collaboration with all the communities on planning for extreme weather response shelter. We want to recognize that piece of planning is still needed. Staff have recently identified that the current process that we're going through with Lisa Moffat is here. Our consultant that will be presenting on our homelessness needs assessment and community plan. We'll be speaking about that later. However, the extreme weather response shelter needs, the planning for this coming winter will need to be happening prior to the conclusion of our homelessness community plan. So CVRD and City of Courtenay staff will be meeting shortly to discuss opportunities to support and expedite the EWR planning in advance of the conclusion of the work that we're going to be talking about today. So we expect to provide the board with more information and recommendation in the near future. So all of these pieces that we see here in the concurrent work are certainly feeding into the work that we're doing right now, but it's really important to recognize the volume of what is already being done and what we will be able to augment this work with through these three projects that we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As both Jake and Allison have mentioned, based on the direction that we received from you back in 2023, we've pulled together 3 initiatives that are the subject of today's discussion, and we're being supported by our consultants. So the first, the RGS Housing Action Plan, the Homelessness Needs Assessment and Community Plan is the second presentation today, and the Exploration of Direct Actions as the third presentation. And those are those actions that you may take as a board to make the most of your sphere of influence and jurisdiction in the realm of housing with supports. Each of these projects are individually complex, as you may guess, and you will note their points of intersection through the upcoming presentations. You'll be receiving a lot of detail today, a lot of information, data, ideas, best practices, illustration of the systemic nature of some of the challenges that we're facing, as well as a sense of how you might be able to coalesce as a board to lead the region in achieving the right housing supply to meet the needs of our evolving and diverse population. Each of the projects is in its relatively early days, but we are looking to you today for some feedback. Firstly, as you listen to the RGS Housing Action Plan presentation, please consider the draft goals that are presented to you that have been identified thus far, and whether or not they resonate with you as a guide to coordinate regional housing action. During the presentation from Lisa Moffat on the homelessness needs assessment and community plan work to date, we are keen to hear any questions that you might have about the methodology of the project, as well as questions that you might have to enhance your understanding of homelessness here in the Comox Valley. And finally, in respect to the direct action feasibility project, please consider the range of actions that you might be able to take as a board, where you could have meaningful effect in the creation of non-market rental housing, and consider how you may be able to deliver upon those actions. And then following each of the presentations, of course, you'll have an opportunity for discussion and questions from the presenters and staff. Pardon me. Today's session is part of the target engagement phase in each of these projects that is presently underway. And so your feedback, your discussion today will be incorporated into the design and delivery of each of the 3 projects as a draft. Each project then has milestones coming in summer and fall of this year, with final deliverables in the fall, just in time for the brass tacks work that you'll be digging into of financial planning. And lastly, once the board has approved the plans, they will be shared with our broader community, knowing that that very targeted, deep engagement, sort of with the players and those with skin in the game, is underway now and in the summer. And with that, we'd like to turn the discussion, I believe, over to Courtney Lawrence and Cassandra Vank. I'm looking around, but they're somewhere in the ether. So Courtney Lawrence and Cassandra Vank are leads on the RDS Housing Action Plan.
Just while Lisa's doing that, are there any questions on this kind of opening segment from staff? Okay, all right, sounds good. So we'll just await our presenters. Thanks, Lisa.
Just find them.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Great. So I'm going to take some time this morning and go through our current process and where we're at with the Housing Action Plan. And so if I can, I'm going to share my screen and I'll walk through a presentation this morning. It'll probably take about 20 minutes or so. And then, as Alana mentioned, we have some time for discussion and questions with the board.
Okay, you should be able to actually just getting you in this co-host. Okay.
You can see that okay?
We got it. Thanks very much.
Perfect. So good morning again. Thank you for having me today. My name is Courtney Lawrence and I'm with ISL and I'm part of the Vink Consulting team. So this morning, I'm going to walk you through kind of where we're at in the process on the Regional Housing Action Plan. I'm going to take you through the purpose of it and highlight some of the key findings of the current needs in the community, as well as some of the current housing initiatives that are already well underway. We'll then spend some time talking about the Housing Action Plan framework, which is currently in draft at this point. We've developed through 5 goal areas and some preliminary actions based on our learnings of the community already. And that's where we'll have an opportunity to learn more from yourselves and hear your input as well. And then lastly, we'll take a minute or two to talk about our next steps for our project here. So for the next few slides, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the action plan is and the process to date. So a housing action plan is a guiding document that outlines specific actions for a community to achieve their housing commitments. They inform future decisions and priorities on land use, growth, and development, and help take action to meet the housing needs of people of all ages, abilities, and income levels. The purpose of the Housing Action Plan for the CVRD is to prioritize actions that reflect the regional and municipal commitments, establish a clear link to the housing wheelhouse that is shown on the screen here, and identify timelines for completion. It's also intended to guide coordinated action to achieve that first goal statement of the regional growth strategy. And our housing action plan here is focused on the long-term housing with supports and market rental housing with actions that complement and supplement the work underway through the homelessness needs assessment and community plan and the direct actions feasibility initiatives. The housing action plan is also intended to be used by electoral areas, municipalities, and key industry partners to advance housing priorities. Some of the key benefits of taking a regional approach for a housing action plan include recognizing and supplementing and providing direction for the ongoing work that's already underway, providing that clear framework for strategic and consistent action, providing support for the electoral areas and municipalities and the ability to pool resources to more effectively implement solutions. It also helps to identify tools at a regional level for successful implementation. And it increases funding opportunities as funders may consider proposals where they are priority for the whole region. So our specific work on the Regional Housing Action Plan kicked off a few months ago and involved reviewing background information, current policy documents, commitments that are already well underway, and learning more about the region and the anticipated housing needs and needs of the communities. We've met with members of the Technical Advisory Committee to learn more about what's underway in their respective communities and to provide an overview on the purpose of the Housing Action Plan. The framework for the Housing Action Plan and preliminary actions were developed based on those learnings, which brings us to this session today. We'll then be engaging again with the Technical Advisory Committee members and continuing to build out the action plan, informed by the directions that will emerge through the work on the homelessness needs assessment and community plan and the direct actions initiatives, and then work to finalize the plan in the coming months with the presentation to the board again. So over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to highlight a little bit about the key findings and the regional context of the community. So based on that 2023 draft housing needs assessment that's currently being updated, some of the highlights show that there's an anticipated or current regional population of over 74,000 residents, which is anticipated to grow by about 36% or close to 27,000 residents by 2043. In 2023, there are over 32,000 homes in the region and approximately 1,100 non-market housing units. The median household before tax income was over 77,000, but there's notable differences between owner household median incomes and renter household median incomes at 86,000 and 54,000 respectively. There is an anticipated need for approximately 13,500 homes by 2043, or approximately 800 homes needed annually to meet demand, which is about 300 or over 350 new units above the historical rates of construction. As of 2021, there was a current affordable housing deficit of close to 2,600 households. And it was identified that most households cannot afford the median price for any type of home, putting home ownership out of reach for many residents and increasing pressures on rental housing. Housing developed through the private market has generally been good for higher income households, but there certainly is a gap for those households that are more working age population or have lower incomes who are unable to secure a home through the private market. So that has a need to focus on the right supply of housing and the right locations. So this includes homes that are least likely to be built without additional support and at locations that are best able to be serviced. As spoken to in the first presentation here by Lisa, there are several initiatives already underway to respond to housing needs across the region. These include strategic updates, updates to community plans and zoning bylaws to respond to those directions from Bill 44, implementation of actions identified through the Housing Accelerator Fund, undertaking communities assessments, waivers of development cost charges, implementation of bylaws to provide grants to fund affordable housing and purchasing of land, and advocacy and collaboration among various community partners. And that's just to name a few that's currently underway. So over the next few slides, I'm going to provide an overview of the current structure of the draft housing action plan, and then a summary of the preliminary actions that have been identified to date. Of course, recognizing that the work being completed for the other initiatives will be informing several of these actions that have been identified. So this slide here shows the current structure, or what we refer to as the outline or the framework of the housing action plan, as well as the key components or sections that will be included. The first section will provide an overview of the regional context, as well as the roles and responsibilities of the multiple partners involved in implementation. The second section will highlight the key region context, as well as several actions that are already committed to or underway in the region. And the third section will dig into those key goals and additional actions that could be considered to respond to housing needs. And these actions will also be prioritized with anticipated timing for implementation over the next 5 years, and a link to the segments on the housing wheelhouse will be provided as well. The fourth section will focus on how the actions will move forward and be advanced, and how the implementation can be measured and monitored over the lifespan of the plan. And then the final section will provide a summary on next steps. So through a review of background information, direction provided previously by the board, as well as through the regional growth strategy, 5 goal areas have been developed with accompanying actions to respond to the identified needs. I'm going to take a few minutes to walk through a summary of each of these 5 preliminary goal areas and the accompanying actions. And then we can open the floor for comments and discussion to identify or learn more about whether they resonate with you, or if there's something missing or something else we need to consider further. And as mentioned earlier, these preliminary actions will be further refined and modified based on directions that is coming from the work underway for the homelessness needs assessment, community plan, and the direct actions initiatives. So under goal 1, maintain a shared regional response to address existing and emerging housing needs across the Comox Valley. Preliminary actions in this goal area include partnering in research and data gathering to further understand local housing need, working together to develop tracking and monitoring system of meeting targets of the regional growth strategy, and establishing clear targets and timelines for affordable housing for the region by local municipality and electoral area. Under goal 2, enable the right housing supply by providing a supportive regulatory environment. Preliminary actions include continuing to establish those policies that enable the right supply of housing, in addition to the work already underway to respond to the provincial legislation requirements. So this could include additional policy directions related to inclusionary development, location and availability of facilities and services, and density bonusing, to name a few. Ensuring processes are in place to support matching of residents who are overhoused with those who are underhoused. So if you think of an aging population that would like to downsize, but there may be no homes available, there might be opportunities to explore programs such as home sharing. Implementing processes to further streamline residential development reviews and approvals. So this could include sharing of resources, offering pre-approved building plans for accessory dwellings or multi-unit developments, preparing template agreements to reduce barriers such as time and costs related to housing projects, and establishing a regional information hub as a community and industry housing resource. Under goal 3, facilitate new residential development by identifying suitable land and servicing available. Some of the preliminary actions include locating new residential development in existing or planned future growth areas, developing an inventory of local and external housing resources and assets, Conducting a spatial analysis of the distribution of programs and services across the region to better understand where services are available and located in the communities. Conducting servicing analyses to understand capacity in municipal areas and rural settlement nodes, and working together to support the development of the settlement expansion areas, as well as coordinating infrastructure, land use, and financial planning analysis across the region to understand incremental and full build out of housing based on the new zoning requirements. Under goal 4, increase affordable housing supply, including preserving existing stock. Preliminary actions include developing an affordable and supportive housing land infrastructure plan to map out surplus and available sites across the region, establishing a committee to manage implementation of the plan and considering hiring a dedicated resource to act as a facilitator, working together to support planning for affordable and supportive housing. So this could include identifying suitable sites, determining development plans, soliciting proposals for initiatives, and preparing funding applications. Considering opportunities to amend the current parameters of the service bylaws to align with identified needs, and considering establishing initiatives for new rental housing and maintenance of existing housing. And in this goal in particular, they are to be further refined. The actions are to be further refined once we learn more through the other initiatives. And the last goal, goal 5, continue to strengthen regional coordination and relationships with other levels of the government. So preliminary actions include creating an inventory of all housing partners in the CVRD, engaging with housing partners to understand resourcing, capacity, priorities, advocating for funding programs dedicated to maintenance and upkeep of rental and nonprofit housing, creating a unified voice to advocate for funding support, developing a plan to outline specific funding requirements to address the region's housing needs, and developing educational tools for awareness building and information sharing across the CVRD and electoral areas and member municipalities. So with that, I'll pause there for a moment, and we just are proposing or have a couple of questions we'd like to open the floor with. So we'd like to hear whether you generally agree with the direction of the current preliminary actions, if there's anything missing that should be changed. As Alana mentioned, do the goals and actions resonate with you? Is there anything else that we should be considering at this time? Again, recognizing the work still underway for the other initiatives.
Great, thanks, Courtney. And that's inspired a couple of questions in the room. So I'll just go to some of the directors. I'll start off with Director Kerr. Nope, sorry, that's Arbor. My apologies. There we go.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Courtney, for the report. A couple of questions and then a comment. To me, number 1 and 5 look virtually the same. Could they be collapsed into one? Number 2 and 4 also look virtually the same. Could they be collapsed into one? Goal number 3 is actually a subset of 2 and 4. So I think having 5 goals is a challenge. We should have 1 goal or maybe 2 at most and make them really short. I think the wording in the goals are really too long. We should have a regional response. That's goal number 1. And increase the supply of affordable housing, goal number 2, and everything else collapse under those. Yeah, those are my comments. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Director Kerr, and I'll go to Director.
Thanks, and thank you, Dr. Kerr. Actually, it's the second time in a couple of years that I think you provide some really meaningful framework feedback in terms of simplifying and distilling things into its simplest nature, which is really appreciated because it is a lot to absorb. And I think you're right. If we pass this on to the community partners, I think you start to get some eyes glazing over. And I'll comment actually on the 2 goals you just created. One around the regional approach. I think that's where it has, for me as rep from Area A, it has the greatest risk. In the sense that I think there is a little bit of not division, but just different perspectives on the board, I guess. where we stack against, when municipal colleagues think about growing affordable housing, they really go to put housing where the services are and where existing services are. Whereas when you're in the rural areas and you're aware of all the housing needs in rural areas, we're trying to create complete communities in those communities. And that looks very different than just trying to go for mass volume of housing. I'll give you an example, in this feedback from the consultant, like when we talk about, and then moving to goal 2 from Dr. Kerr, how do we actually achieve this to increase the housing supply? I'll be very specific. There's a house in Royston for sale right now on Royston Road, and it's 3 minutes to the beach. Okay, and it's just beside the community hall. $700,000 in Royston. It's a 3-bedroom. It's an older home. This, if we had a rental bank, this would get picked up right away. A lot, and what the consultant talked about is, a lot of the new builds favors higher incomes, like it's expensive to build. And I think in rural areas, it's going to be critical to look at the existing housing stock to secure affordable housing, stuff that's already there. The likelihood for this house, somebody's going to pick it up, it's going to get demolished, we're going to end up with a multi-million-dollar home. And it will be one less worker in Royston that works there, or one less family that sends, that is in the working class or on the low income spectrum. So going back to goal 1 from Dr. Kerr, when you talked about that regional response, I have both tremendous hope and tremendous concerns, because everybody's going to pitch into this. And I think the solutions are going to look quite different unless we decide, and it's a 7-3, there's only 3 rural directors. So I do have those concerns that when we talk about a regional response, that regional response should be diverse and acknowledge the geographic diversity and needs of each community.
Thanks, and appreciate that perspective. We'll take it to Director Grieve.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Courtney. I want to clarify something around the Technical Advisory Committee. You're looking around this table and you're seeing a lot of elected officials who may or may not have any experience in how to hold a hammer and build a house or secure mortgages or whatever. And I think it's important that we actually talk to the people who have the boots on the ground out there. So I'm just wondering who's going to select this advisory group.
Sure, through the chair to the director, the Technical Advisory Committee refers to staff from the municipality, so CVRD, Courtney, Comox, and Cumberland. And so we have targeted engagement individual interviews planned for those staff members in the coming weeks. And then we intend to supplement those interviews as needed with other industry partners. So that could include builders or contractors or developers to get a sense of what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. So that's the target engagement that we'll be continuing to undertake in the coming weeks.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, the Technical Advisory Committee is the TAC that is formed through the Regional Growth Strategy, which is the planners from the municipalities in the regional district.
Do you want to follow up, Director Grieve? Sorry.
Well, just not to be, to pouring cold water on this, but this is where the old boomer says, we've done that before. To very little, we've had great aspirations. I think we were supposed to cut poverty in half by 2023, and then we all know what happened to the economy. So we're dealing in a free enterprise economy, and I do think it's so important that we engage the free enterprise community and the builders. You're talking about 2,595 units that are currently needed. We don't have enough builders out there to do that, even if we wanted to. So it just seems, it's a huge issue. We talked about it many times before. We talk about, increasing the housing stock. And I think maybe we're going to have to think a little farther outside the box rather than just looking at this like a first world country and a single detached house with the picket fences. it's going to be a lot different than that. Thank you.
Director Grieve and Director Brown.
Thanks, Chair. Just thinking about the regional sort of context of housing and I appreciate I think it's under goal 3, the recognition of needing a spatial analysis for services and programs. So, you know, out in the rural areas and in Cumberland, we don't have any services for underhoused people. We have no social service safety net really at all outside of our community school. And so that I think that mapping of services is critical to this conversation. And then also looking at, like Director Arbor was saying, the different needs for different communities. So in Cumberland, we don't need any more market housing. We don't have room for it. All we need is affordable housing. That's what we have room for. And that is our primary goal. So just, yeah, I'm looking forward to finding ways to prioritize for each community what that need is and then prioritize that as a region. That'll be really excellent work.
Thanks. That's sets the context for the discussions today. So there's no, oh, sorry, Dr. Grant, you just out of my line of vision. My apologies.
Okay. Ignoring me again, I get it, yeah. No, I'm just wondering about, you know, when you get talking about builders and building and looking for land supply and all that, we don't have any land in Comox that we could throw in, so then we have to buy it at market rates. And when you do that, you can't make it affordable anymore. So I'm wondering if there's any thoughts of where we could subsidize, like, I don't think we as the regional district should do it, but the province and the Fed are going to have to come up with subsidizing this housing if you actually want true affordable housing. There's no other way to do it that I can see. We got a guy building 16 rental units in town, 900 square feet. They're going to be $2,400 a month. That's not affordable. And that's as good as he can do. So unless somebody's going to come and drop a whole bunch of money on that, you're just never going to get it.
All right. On that optimistic note, I'll hand it back to Allison. You can start with the next piece, but it's an important and valid point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, can we just go back to Director Kerr? You proposed 2 goals, simplified. Would you mind just reiterating those for us?
Sure, thanks for the question. So if I look at number 1 and 5, number 1 says have a shared regional response, blah, 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 blah. Goal 5 is a regional coordination. So to me, and if you read the subpoints in both of those on those separate slides, it's very much saying the same thing. And Director Arbor, your points are bang on. I agree. You can have a regional approach, but still have community-specific plans. So I think those are, to me, both talking about a regional approach to housing. Again, 5 goals to me is just too many. You need to streamline it and make it very clear to us and the public what we're trying to do. The side point is the goals are way too long. There's way too many words in each one. Okay, score goals, win the game. That's the way you set goals, not really long words like this, sentences like this. So 1 and 5 are the same. 2 and 4 are also the same. Very, very similar and can be collapsed. Housing supply and increasing affordable housing supply. The right housing supply is affordable housing, the non-market rental. We've been talking about that. So collapsing those into simply increasing affordable housing supply or increasing the supply of affordable housing. And 3, as I said, is collapsed in under that. Identifying land, servicing availability, those are like subtext, subcategories of 2 and 4. So 1 and 5, regional approach, 2, 3, and 4, increase the supply of affordable housing. That's really clear what we're trying to do. And I would use as few words as possible.
Thanks. And maybe if I can just, I'm having this sort of cognitive dissonance going on right now, because when we're now back to talking about this sort of broadly affordable housing, but can I assume that the board's focus is still on non-market rental and supportive housing with supports? Is that, I see nods around the head. So there is this focus that remains on that too. Okay, so maybe, you know, I know this is poor Courtney. I feel for you, Courtney. But maybe we can start with Director Kerr's suggestion here that there be some effort to kind of focus, you know, what's been presented on potentially two goals. If we could just, you know, which are a regional approach and increased supply of affordable housing, again, with a priority to non-market rental housing. Maybe can I just suggest a brief discussion about that now? And maybe we could come back to this in the afternoon for a more thorough discussion, but it maybe, to use Courtney's word, just give us a sense if that resonates with the board.
I'd suggest we maybe address the 2 points which arose before your suggestion. Perhaps at that point, we could just walk through the slides, the 5 slides, and pick out the points that we think are perhaps relevant to goals 1 and 2, and see what, because at this point, we've taken it to a very, very high level with just 2 points, minimal words. But Director Arbour and Director McCollum have their lights on, so I'll go to them first, and we'll go for a review.
Yeah, thanks. And I don't know if that's the same for others, but I want to reiterate that the presentation from Courtney, like is excellent. It's got everything. It's just a rejigging, I think, of how it's presented and how we think about it. And I think Dr. Kerr is right that when we speak publicly, the more clarity and the more succinct we can be, the better it is all the time. So I think it's excellent work that's in there. So if those things become sub-strategies rather than just, you know, the goal, to me, that makes sense. And just so on reflection, everything that's in there, I think we've got the ingredient to produce the housing action plan, and also as further feedback on the slide that was showcasing what the outline of the report looks like. I thought that was very good as well. It was and I could see how when I engage with nonprofit housing partners in Area A or on the islands, I'm pretty sure it will make sense to them as well. So I just want to provide that context that, to me, I didn't take it as criticism. I just took it as crystallizing an essence that will be important publicly.
Yeah, thanks, Director Arbour. And I think that point, making that point to Courtney, it was just trying to clarify them and distill the many points into a couple of focus areas. Please don't take this as a critique of the work that you've been doing. I'll pass it on to Director McCollum.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak in support of this as well. When I looked at the slides earlier, I had the same thought that 1 and 5 were just kind of breaking out one idea into 2 separate points. And if we wanted to keep the other levels of government, if we just put in collaboration both regionally and with higher levels of government, we could keep that piece. Although I do feel like, you know, we're broaching this with an audience that is pretty well versed in what the environment is around developing non-market housing. And I feel like we could probably leave out the other levels of government, because I think that's very well understood that that's how this works. But if we feel the need to include what I think is fairly pretty much a given, we could include that, just that little piece, so that it's still there. But yeah, our focus here for this exercise, I think, is the regional piece. And then I agree that there's enough overlap with goals 2, 3, and 4 that we could work that into one goal and yeah, have the subpoints that cover what's listed on the slide that we're looking at. Thanks.
Thanks, Director McCollum. And Director Kerr, if you want to just provide some further points on your distillation down to 2.
Yeah, just really quickly, because we're you know, it's hard because we're a hybrid meeting. I just feel maybe I owe Courtney an apology if I came across a little harsh. I love everything in the report. I love every bullet and sub bullet and sub bullet in goals 1 to 5. I want to do it all. I want to do it all yesterday. But I'm just talking from a communications perspective, how we communicate with the public, keeping it as simple as possible, and also in a strategic planning session like we are today, just to keep us laser focused on the 2 things we're actually trying to do, with all of this included in sub points and all of that. So thank you, Courtney, for the tremendous work. Sorry, I'm a morning person, so sometimes I come out of the gates a little faster than others.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. And I guess I just wanted to just see if around the table if there are any other responses to sort of distilling it down from 5 to 2, if people are finding that a helpful framework or have any other perspectives on that. Anyone who hasn't spoken yet. Director Hillian.
Thanks, Chair, and I will just apologize for being late this morning, but I'll spare you all the reasons. I agree with the points that have been made, primarily for the ease of communication to the community. But I think there's another issue that relates to that, and that it's the blue sentence at the bottom. I realize this wasn't spoken to in the initial presentation, but I honestly don't understand why we're going to do another homelessness needs assessment, given the number that have already been done, dating all the way back to the Mayor's Task Force on Housing in 2007. I'm very mindful of an editorial written in our local paper back in September, talking about how local government does a lot of talking, but there isn't actually any action that's forthcoming. And I think that I need some further explanation about why a component of this is a further homelessness needs assessment. Even though I know the importance of talking to people with lived experience, my sense is that people out there with lived experience will wonder, why are we talking to them again about what they need when it's been stated pretty clearly on numerous occasions. Thanks.
Sure, and that Dr. Hillian, that's going to be a great segue when we get to this next presentation, PowerPoint. So there'll be more explanation and hopefully provide some context around the homelessness needs assessment and community plan. Lisa and our consultant will share more on that. I wanted to just come back to the distillation, the 2 goals and the 5 goals that Courtney presented. I think that's a great discussion. I think that is the purpose of having these sessions here, is to look at what has been presented. And Courtney was responding to the, in part, the ask for the housing action plan, which is coming out of the RGS, which is not solely about affordable housing. It is a more broad piece, and the regional housing needs report that is part of the agenda that we've just recently presented. That's part of the mix as well. So I think that's where Courtney was coming from. It is a broad piece. That said, I do appreciate the board is coming around to these 2 more clear and specific actions around regional approach to affordable housing and then increasing affordable housing supply. So I think there's room here for both aspects to be brought forward. Alana, I'm not sure if you wanted to jump in at all, speak more about the concept of the housing action plan under the RGS, and that it is not meant just on affordable housing. It is more broad, but I think from a communications and a laser focused perspective, we can certainly incorporate both. And of course, the intent here today is to have this dialogue, and then Courtney and staff will be able to glean from you the direction that we're going in and come back with the final reports later on. But Alana, did you want to jump in more on the housing action plan and?
Through the chair to the directors, I think you've nailed it, James. Like, I think the points are well taken. If this was just focused on a regional affordable housing action strategy, then we would want to make that really clear. And maybe you go that route. Maybe you give us that direction. But in this instance, the work that we've commissioned Courtney and Cassandra to do is a little bit broader, to help us implement those broader housing needs that do include interventions across the spectrum. And sort of speaking to the development industry, the majority of our development industry is focused in the market realm. And so they're certainly looking for actions to be taken. Bill 44, the housing legislation, that's about market housing. And communities are working hard. You're all working hard at your council tables in the EASC to implement that bill. So yeah, your points I think are bang on, and I'm sure Allison will come back and help facilitate a bit more of this discussion around maybe distilling. Thank you.
Thanks. Alison, I was going to ask you what you think is the best way forward. I think we've had a chance to hear from the table, and it sounds like we're going from 5 points down to 2. I'm wondering if you think that'd be more useful to save the sort of fleshing out and further discussion on those 2 points for the smaller group discussions this afternoon, and perhaps continue with the presentations. Now we've got that kind of extremely helpful, and thanks Director Kerr, distillation of the HAP. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's what I'd like to suggest, is that we leave this here. The other presentations will come back to this afternoon, and that'll give the chance for the staff to give this some thought too.
Director Arbor.
Yeah, this is actually, I think Alana's comment was really good, because I think she's right that a lot of the legislation coming down is going to favor market housing, and a lot of our work is going to be towards some form of market housing. But what we're seeing with this initiative and in our strategic plan is, whereas we will go through the steps to address Bill 44 and all the rest of that, that is not the priority of this board. I think what I've heard over the years is that we want to create non-market housing. And maybe in that there's a criticism of provincial federal policy and how they're like build or lose funding. And that's all parties are doing that right now. And I think it's misdirected, when what we really need is what we're describing. So I'm going to be really proud that our housing action plan, maybe some developers won't see themselves in our housing action plan, but if we're going to make a difference to low income and working class households, what we're recognizing today is it's not going to come through market solution of just continuing to increase the density of $1 million homes and such, right? Which has been the trend for 30 years.
Thanks very much, Director Arbor. And Alison, do you want to lead on with the next part of the presentation? Or I'm not sure, James, if you want to pass on to staff.
Sorry, so we'll just move on to the next presentation. Yeah, and we'll come back to this in the afternoon.
So yeah, I think then the next part of the presentation is around the homelessness needs assessment and community plan. And Lisa Kilpatrick, will you be introducing Lisa Moffat? Lisa.
Sure. Thank you. Through the chair to the directors, I would like to introduce Lisa Moffat. Lisa Moffat is with Resilience Planning, and she's been working with our team and her team for the last couple of months on the homelessness needs assessment and community plan. So I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you, and thrilled to be in a room with several other Lisas today. How lucky you all are. I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement honoring the lands we're on. So it's important for me and my team, for me to take a moment at the top of the presentation to recognize the territories and people who will be impacted by this work. My team and I honor the Ayajutham speaking Comox First Nation peoples and their right to self-determination. We know that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by experiences of homelessness due to the historic and ongoing impacts of colonial violence, Indigenous communities, and their members' experience, leaving them vulnerable to violence and death. The disproportionate number of toxic drug supply related deaths impacting Indigenous community members indicates a need for systemic changes and supports to be culturally sensitive. Centering Indigenous worldviews is key to decolonizing solutions to meet the needs of the most harmed and most vulnerable, including and beyond Indigenous community members. We hold this truth in our hearts in this time of reconciliation and look for ways to pair those experiences and those losses with reconciliation work that we as settlers are called to do. We also honor the community resilience of these nations who continue to steward these beautiful lands and waters that feed us, bring us respite, call us to connect with, enjoy the most beautiful place in which we live. I appreciate the discussion on the previous presentation because I think what you're getting at is the need to do things in a different way. So I appreciate Director Greaves' comment that, you know, we've done this before. And so I offer this quote from Albert Einstein that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we use to create them. So I think part of this presentation will really encourage you to think outside the box and think in the ways that we can change systems to better address needs for people who need us to do that. My presentation today will include an overview of our project schedule, a context of our understanding of homelessness at a high level, and the keys that inform the elements of our response, defining homelessness, so coming to agreement on what we're talking about when we say people experiencing homelessness or unhoused community members. I'll give you an overview of what we're learning from our background document review, and we'll talk about setting the baseline. So, you know, it's important to measure the existing context, so defining that baseline. And then as we set targets for implementation, we can measure performance and success against that baseline. And then we'll talk about some of the mapping that we've done. Cassandra Bink's team mentioned that mapping was important, and so we've done some initial service mapping that we will ground truth with people with lived and living experience this week. And I'll provide an overview of some of the engagement approach and touch points that we'll have on the project. So our project schedule, as Lisa Kilpatrick mentioned to you, and Elena, we're in early stages here. So we've completed a background document review and we've set the baseline. We understand what the baseline data looks like. And now we're here beginning to host engagement events. We started engagement this week. And again, I'll provide you with an overview of what we're doing there. Through the summer, we'll move into data analysis and produce a what we heard report, which will inform some of the targets and indicators we'll define through August and September, as well as the draft community plan in the fall. And then we look forward to presenting that plan to the community in October. So I provide this graphic to help us all understand that providing solutions for homelessness is not just rooted in housing. So what we experience on a daily basis and what you probably see in the street and what I'm hearing is the experience in the rural community, is the experience of symptoms of experiences of homelessness. And what we don't see are the root causes of why people experience homelessness. And that's what this community plan hopes to address. So those root causes include structural factors that can be economic and societal issues that affect opportunities and social environments for individuals. They can include a lack of adequate income, access to affordable housing, and health supports, as well as experiences of stigma and discrimination. So shifts in the economy, both nationally and locally, can create challenges for people to earn an adequate income and pay for food and housing. And I think we saw in the early days of COVID with CERB payments, how quickly we are able to provide a universal basic income for people. And why we aren't able to do that regularly is a compounding factor for people's experiences that put people in precarious situations. There are also systems failures. So these occur when other systems of care and support fail, requiring vulnerable people to turn to the homeless sector. Examples of system failures include difficult transitions from child welfare, inadequate discharge planning for people leaving hospitals, corrections and mental health substance use support facilities, and lack of support for immigrants and refugees. And as well, there are individual and relational factors that people experience that apply to their personal circumstances. These may include traumatic events, so a house fire or a job loss, intergenerational trauma because of colonial violence, personal crisis, so somebody may experience a family breakup or domestic violence, mental health and substance use disorder challenges, including brain injury or fecal alcohol syndrome. These can both cause and be consequences of homelessness, and physical health problems or disabilities. Relational problems can include family violence and abuse, substance use disorders, and mental health problems of other family members, and as well as extreme poverty. So you can see how these factors are complex and external as well as internal to the person experiencing homelessness.
I know we like the housing wheel, and I also really like the housing wheel, and I don't usually present housing on a continuum like this, but you can see how complex this diagram is. So having it on a continuum was easier to illustrate for you. And so what this is showing is really that summary of the root causes here. So you can see the green arrows move people up and away from experiences of homelessness, and the orange arrows can bring people back. So if you look at the very first, the red color, with the tent, so experiences of homelessness, to move from experience of homelessness to emergency shelter, somebody just needs shelter. To move from homelessness to transitional housing, people will need help with, will need other supports. So they might be suffering from substance use disorder, being released from incarceration, have mental illness that they need help with. People can also move from experiences of homelessness into community housing with family or community connections and services. You can move from community housing to affordable rental housing with improved employment. You can move from community housing to market rental with increase in income. You might be in a market home, but experience domestic abuse, financial struggles, substance use disorder, illness, or mental health, and might fall all the way back down the continuum of housing to experiences of homelessness. You might be an elderly couple and a loss of a partner changes your income, and that might move you from secure market housing into an affordable rental. You might suffer severe illness or job loss, moving you from market rental and in need for affordable rental. So I offer this as a way of illustrating the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with. And again, it's housing and that the solutions look like. And with that, there are several factors that support successful response to homelessness. So breaking the narrative on the myths of how and why people come to experience homelessness or come to be unhoused or precariously housed. Responding to encampments centering human rights and dignity. Having all of your belongings collected and thrown into a dumpster in front of you is not a way to address these issues with dignity. Creating awareness campaigns about causes and conditions of homelessness can help build compassion and empathy in the community where, we are experiencing NIMBYism, and banana is a new term that we're talking about. So build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. You're welcome to use that one. Building supports and spaces with resources for people to create community. I mean, something that we're learning, my team does work in extreme heat plans as well. And something that we're learning is if people know their community members, they're likely to check in on them and care for them. And that idea of a community care web plays a really prominent role in providing solutions here. Enhancing competency around housing first, which is getting people into housing and providing the services and support to successfully keep them in housing. Developing a system of interagency collaboration across jurisdictions. And again, some of these things are happening and happening with good success. These are just a combination of things that lead to successful responses. Developing a continuum of care, including harm reduction. And we're seeing now with the reversal of decriminalization, people are moving further into rural areas away from services and putting themselves at additional risk and risk of death. Mapping existing services and identifying gaps, and I'll show you what we've done so far for mapping services, and developing street outreach programs, and that are peer-led, because people who've had the experience understand the experience. And when you see somebody reflected in the solutions, you're more likely to be trusting and to participate. So representation matters. Defining homelessness. This is a definition that we offer from the Indigenous Homelessness Steering Committee for Metro Vancouver. So there are two groups of people who experience homeless. The first are considered absolute homeless, and the second group are those who live at risk of experiencing homelessness. And then again, because this is such a complex issue, we offer these 12 dimensions of homelessness as experienced by Indigenous people, described by Jesse Thistle. And so these include historic displacement from pre-colonial industrial and Indigenous lands. Sorry, I didn't advance the slide. Contemporary geographic separation, so individual or community separation after colonial control. spiritual disconnection from Indigenous worldviews, connection to creator or the equivalent deity that people honor, having mental disruption and imbalance. So mental homelessness, being removed from your lands is a form of mental homelessness. The imbalance of mental faculties caused by colonization's entrenchment of marginalizing Indigenous people, cultural disintegration and loss, so a total dislocation or alienation from your Indigenous culture and relationship web, overcrowding. In many cases, we're seeing the number of people per dwelling exceeding the national occupancy standard, which there are also some issues with that, which can create unsafe and unhealthy and overcrowding living spaces, which in turn can cause experiences of homelessness. Relocation and mobility, so mobile Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness, traveling for access to work or health, education, recreation, legal and childcare services, spiritual events and ceremonies, to access affordable housing, to travel to visit or take care of community and friends, or friends and family in different communities. Going home, so Indigenous individuals or family members who have lived or grown up outside their home community and come home and are seen as experienced as outsiders, making them feel unsafe and providing insecurity and homelessness and accessing home. Having nowhere to go, a complete lack of access to stable shelter, housing, accommodation, services, or relationships. Escaping or evading harm, so fleeing or leaving unstable or unsafe, unhealthy, or overcrowded homes for safety or to survive, which really impacts young people, women, members of the LGBTQIA2S+ community are particularly vulnerable. Emergency crisis, so natural disasters, human mischief and destruction, bureaucratic red tape, when the system is not ready or willing to cope with an immediate demand for housing. And here we're talking about environmental racism and racism in systems. Climate refugee homelessness, so Indigenous people's lifestyles around sustenance and food sources, relationships to animals, connections to land and water are greatly altered by drastic cumulative weather shifts due to climate change, making individuals and entire Indigenous communities homeless. These are the background documents we reviewed. I won't read all these. I'll leave them up for a minute so you can get a sense of the type of documents that we initially reviewed to understand the context here locally. And so some of our takeaways around the context include affordability. So of the 272 people identified as experiencing homelessness in the 2023 PIT count, point in time count, 97% of them reported having an income. And affordability was cited as the #1 reason for job loss. And of those 272 people, 27% identified as Indigenous, 17% were seniors, and others had brain injuries and health concerns. The in and visibility of experiences of homelessness. So the overall increase in people being counted correlates with the increase in the number of shelter spaces available. So people were able to be counted, whereas before so this is providing perhaps a more accurate number of the experience. And people are also staying outside in vehicles and at someone else's place. Barriers that people experience include barriers to employment, which are affordable and reliable transportation, access to affordable childcare and in locations that work for families, stigma and lack of education. Barriers to services include stigma and discrimination. People don't know about services or programs are so siloed, there's no collaboration across service providers. And the design of spaces is not welcoming for people. And this includes indoor and outdoor spaces. Barriers to thriving include access to housing, community programs, healthcare, recreation, cultural competency, and trauma-informed care. Other things we learned about the context, the vulnerable populations are those relying on single income, such as lone parents or single individuals, Indigenous households, households with a transgender or binary member, households with refugee members. They all exhibit higher rates of core housing need compared to overall households. Renters, almost a quarter of renters are in core housing need, 22% for the CVRD and 26% for the city of Courtenay. Affordability is the biggest core housing need factor for renter households. So rental costs have increased by 51% across the CVRD over the course of 4 years between 2019 and 2023. Shelter beds are only provided in Courtenay, so housing support programs and non-market housing are provided in other municipalities as well. But I think we all recognize that Courtenay is the non-market center of the region and the service center for this region. There is an affordable housing deficit, approximately 2,600 households that Cassandra shared, so 8.6% could have benefit from affordable housing in 2021. And this number may have increased from 2021 due to the rise in market housing costs. So who is at risk? The most vulnerable people at risk include households with very low income, and that can include families. So the Coalition to End Homelessness reports a high need for housing for families that are adequate, suitable, and affordable. So adequate is in good repair, suitable is the correct number of bedrooms for the number of people, especially different gendered children living in the household. Single person households, the CEH also reports the majority of those in core housing need, 52% are single person households. The population is growing for seniors, and they are aging and have complex housing needs, wanting to age in place, which for some means staying in their homes, as well as aging in place in community. So to stay connected to those care webs that I mentioned and to services that support them. And having those housing typologies where people can transition out of single family dwellings and stay in community. And then as well as seasonal employees, so income generating households who need affordable housing during high tourist season and through agricultural work. As well, poverty is not simply a lack of income, it's the absence or lack of resources to address the essential needs required to maintain a healthy standard of living. And impacts of poverty on children specifically include heightened child vulnerabilities, poor health, and potential increased crime costs. So what is needed? In our early discovery, we're recognizing that community residents need adequate income and disability assistance, rent supplements, housing that addresses needs through different typologies, tenure, support services, et cetera. Housing that is proximate to services and amenities. And the more vulnerable you are, the higher your need is to be closely located to services and amenities. Effective public transportation and community support for substance use disorder and mental health. We need a coordinated response. So this coordination across different levels of government. Cassandra's work recognized the need for collaboration with higher levels of government, with health authorities, service providers, the business community, and law enforcement, et cetera. And we need basic agreements. We need to come to agreement about basic understandings that housing is a human right. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, and everybody needs collective access in an equitable way. So, for example, you could give everybody the same pair of glasses if people need glasses, but if those glasses are not tuned to their correct prescription, they're going to be useless for people. So what's promising, because this can be quite a challenging topic to, it's very heavy. So what we're finding is promising is there are data sharing agreements that are coming about between Island Health, the RCMP, North Island College, and municipalities, which will be helpful to see what the context is and see what the trends are and how they're changing, how they're favorably changing, hopefully over the course of time. Foundry provides great and free services for youth and is new to the region. The homelessness support service that you've supported, so having those dedicated funds to support people experiencing homelessness is very helpful. Providing new housing, so since 2016, there have been 321 units built and 175 of those have been secured since 2021. So seeing those increases is helpful. Also increase in support, so an emphasis on preventing evictions. And then the rent bank has expanded and now it's North Island Rent Bank and it includes the Cathet region where I live as well. And having this rent guide and rent smart workshops all are very helpful. some gaps in solutions that we're seeing. So we need collective solutions that, again, that equitable piece about they work for the individual and that collectively we're working towards them together. Preventing evictions, which eviction can lead to long-term experiences of homelessness. We've learned from the PIC count. Buy-in for innovative approaches. We need solutions beyond shelters and transition homes. We know people don't feel safe in shelters. They don't like accessing them. They really value their independence. So what does an innovative approach that values independence look like? It could look like these turtle pod ideas, peer working opportunities, and social enterprises. People need legal supports and social support and education. So more awareness building about the services that exist and more compassion building in the community to address stigma. Having local options to address treatment for substance use disorder and pairing that with housing and treatment. Housing gaps for those in recovery or seeking recovery. So recovery-oriented housing with that have a group or family environment, farms, tiny homes, local medical detox, more second stage housing, more supportive recovery, social detox beds, and options for home detox. Transitioning, so supports for people transitioning out of supportive housing. So, they're ready to move out on their own, but they still need a bit of help to lift them up as they're moving through that transition. Aging in place, which I've just discussed, and having united advocacy. I like to talk about power in my work, and we're more powerful collectively. So having that united advocacy to advocate to higher levels of government and funding providers that are beyond the jurisdiction of the regional district. We've done some mapping of community services, and as you can see, and I think you're aware, there's a real conglomerate of services here in Courtenay, and the inset map shows that a little bit better. It's a different view of it, but you can see the concentration of services in Courtenay, which relates to the visible experience of people experiencing homelessness here. And then in the inset map, the green pin is showing the new transition housing and emergency shelter, which is approximately 1.5 to 2 kilometers from the service center. So I think it's great. I know you've worked for a long time to get a permanent location here. And again, this will have 45 supportive housing units and an overnight shelter with 35 beds. And there will be some adjustments to the lack of proximity to the service center. So when we're measuring, we want to measure what this looks like so that we understand how well we're addressing these issues. So we set a baseline. So the baseline helps us to set realistic goals and to measure our progress against them. It illustrates what difference the project is making and helps create accountability in the community. It helps set expectations across the community and creates buy-in for the implementation. And it can support policy development as well as grant applications. So we're seeing through COVID and trying to address these root causes. So we have baseline data and indicators across the following categories. Unhoused population trends, we have 99 indicators. Emergency shelter use, there's 5 indicators. Housing support, we have 7 indicators. Housing attainability, also 7. Income, we have 3 indicators. Social factors and support, there's 3 indicators. And vulnerable groups, we have 4 indicators. So 38 indicators total. And we currently have baseline information for 68% of those, which is pretty good. And so what we'll do is we will work with staff across the region and community service providers to see if anybody has data that fills in that other 32% of data that we don't have currently, and also to look for areas that can collect that data if we don't have it currently, that can collect the data going forward. Our approach to engagement really is an equity-based framework. So the term "nothing about us without us" comes from disability advocates in South Africa. So the idea that you're not going to talk about something that impacts us without including us. And then by within for community, which is an Indigenous ways to embed Indigenous ways of knowledge and being. And so again, this idea that community is involved in this plan and community is telling us what they need, and we have the tools to, you know, qualitatively analyze that data and tell them what this can look like and come together on solution building. We also have these guiding principles at resilience planning. So relationship building, we move at the speed of trust. And I think you might be familiar that it might be a familiar idea that frontline service providers are really at capacity. So I appreciate that the meeting is being recorded, because I feel that people would want to be in the audience, but they're just not able because they're really helping people address very basic needs for survival. We infuse dignity in our engagement process, so employing decolonial, anti-oppressive, and trauma-informed practices. One of our members is a social worker and traditional knowledge keeper and trauma-informed practitioner. And we incorporate cultural content, community values, and strength-based methods throughout our engagement. And we go to community. So that means two things. We meet people where they're at physically. So tomorrow we'll be at the library for the discussion circle that CEH hosts with people with lived and living experience. And we meet people where they're at mentally and in their hearts, where this issue is concerned. So we want to make sure that we're bringing people along in the conversation. So we started engagement this week with some interviews which aren't listed here. This afternoon, Lisa and I will meet with local government staff for a workshop. Tomorrow, as I mentioned, we're meeting at the library discussion circle. And in the afternoon, we have a session with the Comox Valley Chamber of Commerce. And we are currently in discussions with representatives from Comox First Nation and working to bring together a workshop with community service providers. And with that, I'll open the floor to any questions.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and Director Arbor.
Thanks, such a great presentation. And I mean, I'd love to hear Dr. Hardy's comments on that, but I thought that the slide on demystifying the 12 dimensions of homelessness for Indigenous people, you didn't have a similar slide for the non-Indigenous people, but you know, that kind of education for the general public, I feel like, you know, this could reframe things on Facebook forums and in our communities in a big way if people actually were better educated around all these circumstances and really broaden their perspective. Because I think we all have busy lives and a lot of people just simplify in their minds what the cause is, and a set of a slide like that really kind of opened my eyes. And it's not like I haven't paid attention, but there's definitely a few dimensions in there that I hadn't thought about. Yeah, I think your approach, I just loved everything in it. The only comment I would leave back is I will try to get you, so the map, of course, did not include Union Bay or Fanny Bay or Hornby or Deadman or Merville and Black Creek. And I can tell you we have, and I know they'll be watching this meeting, Hornby, Denman, Island Care, Home Support. We have we have emergency shelters on Hornby and Denman. So there's actually a number of resources at the scale of those communities, and often volunteer operated, that are really hard at work. But what I'll do instead of just leaving it there is there's a couple of documents in the document review that I'll send you away. Hornby Island is currently completing a housing strategy through the Hornby Island Housing Network. I think we've had over 30 organizations participate in that. And on Denman, they also had a housing plan. They actually created a housing advisory planning commission, which, as far as I know, I'm not sure if any of us have done that in the Valley, but they've come up with a report as well. So I'll just share those with you so you can round up that literature review slide you had. But overall, I just think such a great comprehensive approach to address homelessness and full spectrum. And so I'm really happy with the direction that this work is going in. Thanks.
Thanks. I appreciate getting those resources.
And Director Morin.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Unlike Director Kerr, I start to come alive around 10:20. So this is my first comment of the day, which I know is unusual to people here, but we usually start our meetings later in the day. So, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I love digesting, not the the negative or sad part of the story, but I think just having that context uh, with what we're trying to pursue here. So a couple comments and then one question. I really like the continuum graphic. I'd like to borrow that for my social media for later with full credit, because I think it really illustrates clearly in how people go from, you know, one part of the continuum to the other and back again. And it makes me think of a woman I know who went through a lot of the things in the continuum and ended up in some supportive housing and it's not super happy there. It's not meeting all of the needs, but it's better than being on the street. And then had a significant injury recently and ended up in the hospital. And it's actually become her gateway to better housing, which is sad that she had to experience this significant injury to get to that place. But these touch points where people transition from one phase to another, and having the right people there at the right time to help support going further along that continuum. So I think that's a great graphic. The other piece I thought was really good was the responding to homelessness and that whole piece around you know, breaking the narrative, the awareness campaigns. And I really, you know, I'm not sure what others think, but I really believe that we need to incorporate that in what we're doing in our communications in a really robust way. Because there are so many misconceptions out there. And I think for us, even with our partners, whether that's business folks or developers or whatever, I think that weaving in the context and the myth busting is super important. And then just a question, I think you had mentioned 17% seniors, but it's actually 27% seniors that was in the point in time count. I think it's important to make that distinction because that's almost a third, and it amounts out of the 272 people identified in the point in time count as 74 people. And I think that's like a tragedy that needs to be really, I mean, to me, those 74 people need to be in housing today. We should not have our seniors on the street. I see them in wheelchairs. I see them with walkers to be out in the elements. I think, I mean, what is wrong with this picture? A lot. So I know that seniors has come up a lot through even the previous presentation. We're looking at below market. I really think we need to have some concentrated effort on getting our unhoused seniors into housing like ASAP, as in this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll check that number. Thanks so much for that.
All right, Lisa, thanks. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm not seeing any further questions. Maybe at this point, we'll take perhaps a 10 or 15-minute break at mid-morning. And so it's to maybe see everyone at 10:35 back at the table. Okay, thanks very much.
Oh, God.
No.
All right, I think we're just missing Director Arbor, but I know he's on his way back. So perhaps we'll get going at this point. And Allison, shall I hand it back to you, or James, do you want to lead off? James.
I will, I'll lead off here. So thanks, Mr. Chair. We've had 2 of 3 presentations so far on the housing action plan and then the homelessness needs assessment and community plan, and some good dialogue there. The 3rd presentation is on direct action feasibility. And Jake, I believe you're going to introduce the presentation and the consultant on that. So Jake, over to you.
Thank you, James, and Mr. Chair. Yes, so I'm pleased to introduce Sue Ritchie Raymond with Tim Welch Consulting, as well as Cassandra Vink with Vink Consulting that you've already met, of course, through the earlier presentation. And they're going to walk us through the direct action feasibility work that's been completed. So with that, I think I'll turn matters over to Sue.
Thank you so much. I can share my screen if someone can allow that for the presentation.
You should be able to, so just give that a shot.
Yeah, it's not letting me do that. Sorry. Wait a sec. Here we go.
There we go.
There, can you see that?
Thank you. Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much. It's great to join you today to discuss the direct action approaches to provide and facilitate non-market housing. In the presentation today, we have 5 key objectives that we're trying to accomplish in the discussion with you, is to initially share information about the needs, barriers, and potential gaps in the delivery of new non-market housing in Comox Valley, to outline the roles that CRVD could take to respond to those needs and the potential gaps and barriers that exist, to obtain feedback from the board on which roles are of interest to you, and to outline some potential structures to accomplish those roles at a very high level, as well as opportunities and risks and requirements related to those structures. We will be providing extensive comprehensive detail in the final report for the opportunities, but today is intended to have a high level discussion on what those roles are and then how, through what structures those roles can be accomplished, and to look at the board's feedback on which structure you'd like us to consider further. And so I will give some background information as well on the process we've undertaken, as well as some of the engagement that's been completed to date and the findings of our research. Following the board's input today, then our next step in engagement will be meeting with municipal staff to discuss further actions. So just with respect to background, the purpose of the work is to assess the feasibility of direct action strategies for delivering new non-market housing, and to outline how those strategies can be structured and implemented, including identifying opportunities, implications, and risks, and develop a recommended approach with detailed information on the business and service model. The process that has been undertaken to date comes in 4 phases. The project initiation, which is the engagement planning and engagement activities, the assessment of housing needs, which is where we're at today in terms of finalizing the assessments and reviewing the models for delivery and new market housing, And then looking in phase 3 at assessing and comparing the direct action approaches and identifying the options and preliminary recommendations on approach. And then there will be a final report that will provide recommendations, and then there'll be a presentation to the board. So the intent is to further your discussions you've had over the last year or so about what some of the opportunities may be today, and to help to narrow the focus on what the opportunities are and get input from you that will lead us to specific strategies that will include both short, medium, long-term opportunities and outcomes that can be considered. So with respect to findings, whoops, I've just flipped. The engagement to date, we have met with a number of interested and affected parties locally. We've spoken to partners, CMHC and BC Nonprofit Housing Association, as well as parties involved in actions in other communities to get some thoughts on their progress and the actions that they have taken. In addition to that, for findings, we know from the discussions previously related to the 2003 housing needs assessment that about 320 non-market housing units are needed per year to meet the full need of non-market housing. And based on the report from the coalition, they've identified about 54 units have been produced per year between 2016 and 2022. So what does it take to develop new non-market housing? There are several key things that are needed, starting with the what does it take? What are the barriers and gaps, and what are the roles that can be taken? Organizations need to be committed and have capacity to address the needs. There needs to be early financial resources available. So that includes the need for land and or equity provisions early on in the development process to obtain necessary government funding and financing. Needs to be a suitable site for the location of the housing if it's new or a retrofit of an existing building. There needs to be a team of professionals with a range of skill sets that include project management, and some of these professional teams include development consultants. And there is a need for the coordination of many aspects of the project from pre-construction through construction and then post-construction stages for the project. There needs to obviously be a building design that's suitable for the population that's being served. There need to be planning and building approval. So municipalities have the ability to set the regulatory framework that would support the removal of any barriers to the creation of housing. There needs to be secure funding and financing, and this is really a complex part of development. Most affordable development requires substantial funding as well as some form of financing. So for discussion purposes, and just to set the context for that, if the total capital cost per unit were around $375,000, which is the cost of a recent project in the Valley, when that is rented at an average market rent of $1,475, the project could carry approximately $175,000 in debt financing per unit, but that would require $200,000 in financing and funding up front for the capital construction. And that would be needed, including ongoing operating subsidies to further reduce those rents, particularly for populations where there are additional support services provided. In particular, has been discussed in the previous presentations, the need for supportive housing for individuals with greater needs. And then finally, of course, what's needed is management of the construction, the expertise and skill set to manage the construction projects, to reduce risk related to that, ensure completion and deliverable milestones. And then the final stage is the rent up, and that's occupancy of the building as quickly as possible to reduce the gap time from generating revenue, property management and the long-term operations, as well as the provision of support services on site. With respect to existing capacities, barriers and gaps, over the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about what those capacities are, some of the gaps and barriers, and then talk a little bit about some of the options. So with respect to the capacities, barriers, and gaps, the organizations need to, as I mentioned, be committed and have the capacity to address the need for the creation of housing. Comox Valley has nonprofit organizations that are committed to developing and securing new affordable housing. There are 7 different nonprofit providers that have developed or secured about 321 affordable rental units since 2016, so the past 8 years. A few of them have demonstrated a willingness to take on more significant capital projects. 4 of the nonprofit providers have engaged in medium-sized developments that range from 22 to 52 units, and 3 of these have developed 2 projects in the past years or have their second project underway. The private sector hasn't shown significant commitment to leading the development of non-market housing in Comox Valley to date. And this suggests that while the community has nonprofits that are committed and ready to develop, there is a challenge for some between what they're able to deliver and what they require in terms of supports to meet the needs and needing additional supports. With respect to financial resources, most nonprofits have identified they don't have existing land to leverage and have limited equity for the acquisition of that land. They would be looking for grants, and we know there's some existing grants through the HSS fund that are helpful but not sufficient to meet the need to move forward with the development that is needed. And then lastly on this slide, looking for a suitable site. So nonprofits have indicated that they face difficulties in identifying and securing the land. It's often a complex process, and the cost of purchasing the land, it can be very competitive in the private market, and it puts the development of non-market housing at a disadvantage. Costs are higher as well. CVRD, we know, does not have much of its own land, but some local municipalities do have a few sites, and at least one local municipal council has identified the need to consider a land acquisition strategy, but they don't necessarily have staff that can manage the land acquisition responsibilities and skills. So something certainly to be considered. With respect to existing capacities, barriers, and gaps for staffing supports, as I mentioned, a professional team is needed. The nonprofits that we have spoken with have led some larger developments, but they've generally engaged an external consultant to coordinate the development. Others have indicated they could benefit from some additional guidance or project management supports from outside parties to support them with development. From planning and building approvals, nonprofits have indicated that there are some delays in their developments due to some lengthy planning approval processes, so something that can be considered. And securing funding and financing, as I mentioned, the costs are significant, and securing the additional funding and financing to build housing is complex. Part of the challenge is getting a site to a state of readiness to be in a position to be able to apply for funding through the federal and provincial government. So many municipalities across the country are looking at ways in which they can support that to get not-for-profits or corporations to the point of readiness to be able to apply for that funding. And then building design and construction, there aren't really significant challenges that in securing the professional supports that they need for the design or the contractors. They're generally able to secure the professional support from the design perspective. And some of the not-for-profits have indicated they have capacity to operate the new market housing and provide supports, but delivering those supports becomes a challenge for them if they don't have secured funding. So as indicated in some of the previous presentations, one of the significant needs that's been identified is the supportive housing or housing with supports for individuals with more complex needs. And that operational funding is significant in order to ensure the project is viable from that perspective. With respect to the roles the CRVD could take on to respond to the needs and gaps, certainly CRVD could provide one or more supports that have been mentioned to or to partner with interested parties, particularly nonprofits, to facilitate their increased level of development, and could additionally look at developing non-market housing directly, either through internal staff resources or through an external entity at arm's length. There's a couple different opportunities there. With respect to early financial resources, providing additional early financial resources to support that pre-construction phase that I mentioned that allows getting the site to shovel readiness is important, and it could be an opportunity where the district could play a role to support the leveraging of additional capital funding and financing through senior levels of government. And then the suitable site, the opportunity to identify and assess and secure perhaps surplus land or land that's available within the district for those activities. And then the roles that the district could take on to respond to the needs and barriers with respect to a professional team, the provision of assistance and guidance to prospective parties who are interested in non-market development who might have less experience, so there perhaps is an ability to expand resources within the district to provide that support. There can be support to nonprofits with skill building or provision of workshops or funding for training and workshops. So there are organizations like the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, if you're not aware, that do provide workshops, the Ready, Set, Build workshops that are provided to not-for-profit groups, faith communities to build skills at the local level within their organizations for the management or preparation for development activities. And the district could certainly facilitate partnerships or mentorships between parties where you have organizations who perhaps have more experience than others, and to do a little bit of matching to help them to build their skills and provide a little bit of mentorship in that process. And then on planning and building approvals, there can be assistance provided to not-for-profits with navigating the planning and approval processes and coordinating with municipal and district planning staff to fast track approvals. And lastly, securing funding and financing would be looking at the additional capital funding to support feasibility along with the federal and provincial funding. That does support an application for those funding, not just getting to that shovel-ready process, but demonstrates what's the contribution that's already been provided, whether it's provided at a local municipal level or provided through a nonprofit. For all of those additional funding streams, there is a requirement of contribution to the project. So I'm going to just stop there for a moment. We had thought that we would engage in a bit of a discussion about the roles that I've mentioned and get some of your thoughts on some of the specifics on what you're looking at, what you're interested in. We'll be discussing the pros and cons of some of the specific structures on those roles in a few minutes. So I just thought I'd pause for a moment to see if anyone had any questions on this section on the what activities that the district could take on.
Great, thanks very much, Sue. And I see some lights coming on with questions. I'll start with Director Harbour.
Okay, thanks. I was checking if someone else wants to go first this time, but no. So yeah, this one, thank you for that. It's really good overview. It's not clicking as much for me because of comments I made earlier. And I think when Lisa talked about we won't solve the problems with using the same mindset then that created it. I think what we've heard today is we have a major gap in the number of units that need to be created overall, both market and non-market housing. And that gap, you know, there's a construction capacity gap. And I think builders are going to continue to build what enhances their profit margins. And so that's why early on I talked about one of the strategies I'm hoping from in our non-market housing strategy is I try to think differently, and I think about where does the affordable housing currently exist? People who are low income, it exists in old structures, you know, and for me, it's more about trying to preserve that existing affordable stock. And I realize there's a risk with that if we enter that space, because that stock may not be up to code. It may have issues with the houses that are there. But that is where I think if you're trying to create, say that you want, going back to my Royston example, that house that's for sale for 700 grand, that's almost waterfront, right? You're not going to build a 3-bedroom for 700,000 right now. So for me, the better bang for the buck is to look at that stock where, from an asset management perspective, it's not a write-off, but it's not great, right? Like to try to, sorry, I'm thinking in area A perspective, but if I think in municipal perspective, I think we saw Courtney look at that and the province look at that when they took over the Super 8 motel. And so there might be apartment buildings that we could, existing apartment buildings in town that we could take over that may be at risk of redevelopment. So for me, that's the piece that's missing. I think that if we chase trying to support, like doing the same thing we've been doing, which is to support the coalition and nonprofits to build new housing, they're competing with builders and construction and prices that are really high. And then you're really reliant on the province or federal government to chip in. You know, so that economic analysis, anyways, I'm not saying I'm right, but I would love to see the economic analysis of what is the better bang for the buck if we're going to secure and grow a non-market housing stock.
Thanks, and Director Brown.
Thanks. I was going to talk about an additional role potentially being pre-approved plans for various sized dwellings. Could be a role particularly for municipalities. And I'm not sure what work the province is doing around that, but I know that was a conversation at both of the housing summits. But I also just want to back up to what Director Arbour was talking about. We have a similar situation in the village and some affordable homes, or even, you know, picking up Nickel Brothers homes and moving them and adding a story or two. That I think there's a huge opportunity there as well, where there's land available or existing housing that's sitting vacant or a good deal. So would support that work as well.
Thanks, Director Brown, and I'll pass it over to Director Hillian.
Thanks, Chair. I was struck by what seemed like an absence in the partner agencies that were contacted. I didn't see any mention of the Co-op Housing Association. And I'm wondering if co-op housing has been dismissed as for some reason, because it strikes me that you know, there's still there's room for that, and we've seen evidence of projects in other parts of the province that have built, mainly the Lower Mainland, but to some extent Southern Vancouver Island. We tried to get one off the ground here a few years ago, and we didn't get the funding from BC Housing, but I am curious about whether or not you see that as a possibility. And then I have one other question as well. If there's a response to that.
Yeah, certainly through you, Chair, to the Director. It wasn't an intended oversight to not include the co-ops. I think when we're talking about non-market housing, we would certainly be looking at all not-for-profit that would include co-ops. And there's certainly some opportunities as the co-op associations and the federal government look at launching some of the new initiatives to support co-op development that's been significantly delayed, but hopefully by fall will be progressing. So I think any of the strategies that are implemented would support any non-market units coming on. So that would certainly include co-ops. So we'll ensure that we're addressing that in the final report as well.
Okay, and then my other question, and it might actually be for Lisa, because I think that the one thing that we don't have when we look at the needs in the homeless population, I've never seen an actual profile of whether it's the 272 people at that point in time or how that changes over time as to how many actually have the capacity to live in an apartment if one could be provided. How many require complex care because they have addictions or because they behave in a way that gets them kicked out of shelters and other places? How many of them could actually manage in a room and board situation somewhere in the community if we looked at things like home shares with elderly people? Do we have the capacity, or are we restricted by laws of privacy and free choice and the fact that some of these folk don't want to talk to us? Do we have the capacity to get that type of a profile and gear what we go out there and seek to build to those specific profiles?
Good point.
I can potentially speak a little bit to that. I think that is one of the things that has been identified as a need to ensure that the community works towards potentially the development of a by name list where you would need to get consent from individuals to collect their information, but you could, through that process, gather more information on needs and what supports and housing might be most suitable. So I think that is something that the community can consider further.
Great. And did you want to make a comment, Lisa?
Sure, I
Or-
can,
or
yeah.
Lisa?
Through the chair to Director Hillman. Thanks for the question. There are challenges with PIT counts where they only collect so much information, but they do give us some detail. And so, as I mentioned, 97% of the people who were counted in the last PIT count had jobs. So I would assume that would also mean that they could stay in housing. What we're seeing on the PIT count data, and I can send this link to this graphic around, is that 56% of the people didn't have enough income. 31% had substance use disorder issues, 27% had mental health issues. And so it's like the extent to those issues that I think is what you're trying to get at. So I think that's a bit more granular than what the PIT count could provide. Also 17% were experiencing conflicts with spouses or partners, which might mean, they miss days at work. And so then they might be in a position of being fired or let go. So this also describes a number of health concerns. So again, the extent to which these things can impact people's ability to be successfully housed is, I think, on the more qualitative data side of the PIT count. Yeah. There's another form of doing this type of homelessness population estimate that gets into a very lengthy survey. It's like 70 questions. But it does get very, very detailed information. And we've talked to the coalition about potentially using that next time around. Resilience Planning has done that with Castlegar, and it's produced a lot of good quality data and helping to better understand those experiences of people experiencing homelessness that we don't see. So the quote unquote invisible homelessness and people who are at risk of homelessness. So those who might be precariously housed or otherwise at risk.
Dr. Helene, I think you put your light back on. Did you want to ask a follow-up? Okay. I just wanted to ask a quick question if I could, Lisa, and I have a few others I'll ask at the end. The 97% figure, I'd assumed that was income of any kind, disability benefits, pensions, things like that. Are you saying it's employment income? Because that would be a very different way of reading that figure, not the way that I'd read it.
So the most common income sources were income assistance and disability benefit. And then about 7% of the people reported having a full or part-time job.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's an extra piece
Yeah.
of context. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
All right, and Director McCollum, I accidentally put your light on, but I think you're ready to go.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, just looking at what's been presented and kind of where the conversation is going to go or where we're going to focus on where we want to invest our resources and our efforts. And to me personally, I'd really like to see us zero in on the creation of non-market units. and where we can see those biggest gains, and picking up on Director Arbor's point around existing stock. I know that some of the oldest co-op developments in Vancouver were apartment buildings that were acquired as co-ops. So that is a real potential opportunity, and maybe we have a role to play there. I did happen to catch the federal housing minister, Scott Fraser, on the BC Almanac call-in show. I think it was yesterday. And apparently there is some more funding coming for co-ops. So I think we should definitely stay focused on that, or keep that in mind, that perhaps there could be an opportunity to create some immediate non-market housing by enabling that in some way in our community. So I think that's worth focusing on. I think in terms of like single family homes or these opportunities for kind of older stock is, you know, I think it's really going to be difficult to really see the dial moved in a way that we're going from, say, like 3% non-market to 5% if we're focusing on these kind of smaller opportunities. But perhaps there is a way to provide support to you know, smaller local nonprofits that are interested in getting into that space. Whereas maybe with the resources that we have as a bigger organization, we really do want to focus on kind of these bigger projects that are a lot harder to pick up than say grabbing the opportunity on an older home that could get converted into rental stock. So that's kind of where I would like to see this discussion go, is really around these kind of, how do we leverage our resources and our access to capital and our access to higher levels of government to see maximum impact when it comes to non-market, and to focus on that, less so. I think just the complexity of, you know, the people who are currently living unhoused. I think we obviously want to support any opportunity to see more supports and more housing for those populations. But given the service needs, I do think that stays firmly within the provincial mandate. And when it comes to where we can really have an impact, I think it's providing units to ensure that we don't see any further people move into that population in our community. So that's kind of where my thinking is on this at this point.
All right, thanks, Director McCollum, and I'll pass it over to Director Morin.
Great, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I agree with all those points that Director McCollum made. And, you know, focusing on maybe not so much on those smaller opportunities, but my comment was actually around how can we, I think there's a way to put not a lot of resources and effort into supporting that home share model, which Director Grief and I have spoken about, particularly because we have the secondary suite incentive program as well, that $40,000 for the to convert to a suite that's rented out for I think it's minimum 5 years below market. And we know that there's lots of unhoused people, and overhoused people. And I did have a chat with Chris Bate from the Comox Valley Senior Support Society. They're actually doing that, doing kind of a matching in a really informal way, in a pretty low risk kind of way. So there may be some opportunities to support, as Councillor McCollum, Director McCollum mentioned, nonprofits to maybe boost that kind of action in terms of these big empty houses that maybe could even accommodate 2 suites, and then you get 2 seniors in there with another senior, or you get a North Island College student in with a senior to help out. And I think that is something to explore, even though it's not going to create a ton of units. I think there's a way that we could do that would be fairly low workload and, you know, just supporting a nonprofit to kind of get that off the ground, because there's lots of models out there to draw upon as well. So I don't want us to kind of completely lose sight of those seemingly small opportunities, because I think that would also be relevant in all areas of the, you know, there's also rural areas that are very, folks who are very overhoused as well. So yeah, I just wanted to put that in there. Thank you.
Thank you. And Director Kerr.
Just a quick comment. There has actually been a Comox Valley Cooperative Housing Working Group meeting monthly. I've attended most of the last meetings over the last year or so. Some of the usual suspects, Betty Tate, James Taylor, Chris Bate are kind of leading it. Comox Valley Social Planning Society is kind of, I think, a sub-driver of it. And their email address is cooperativehousingcv@gmail.com. So that might be a group that we do want to connect with. They have a lot of energy and need to go forward with this. They see the need, but again, it's just the next steps, and they've been looking for a window. And if we can help collaborate with them, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Director Kerr. And I guess I'll go next to Director Grieve because he hasn't spoken yet. And then I have maybe a few comments, and then we'll go to Director Hellion.
Thanks. Just a quick one through the CAO to the staff. I noticed that Director Morin was talking about that $40,000 grant that the province has available, but my understanding is that we don't qualify as a regional district because we don't have universal building inspection. Is that correct?
Just to follow up, yeah, that Alana just confirmed that is correct. The City of Courtenay, Village Cumberland, Town of Comox are included, but the rural areas are not.
Do you have a follow-up, Director Grieve, or?
Well, pernickety. Also, I mentioned, I heard in a previous presentation mention of density bonus thing, and I think Bill 44 took that off the table as well.
I'll ask Alana to speak to that, just to be clear on what the legislation introduces.
Through the chair to the directors, thank you very much. There's so very much in there, right? So it is, there's many layers. So the piece that has come off or out of our purview, I would suggest, would be that site-specific negotiation that was happening around amenities at the time of rezoning. So that piece hasn't been firmed up in legislation. Density bonusing is still something very much you can use through your zoning tool. You just have to codify it at the outset as a density bonus zone. And so, for example, in the rural areas, we have a few of those, and we could continue doing those. In the areas, so Comox and Courtenay, where the small scale multi-unit housing applies, you couldn't do a density bonus to achieve the minimum that's now required under Bill 44, but you most certainly they could most certainly do a density bonus zone to go over that minimum 3 or 4 units.
So I'm maybe going to launch in with a couple of questions that I had. There was, in terms of professional development, there was noted that project management might be a challenge for some of the groups seeking to develop. And I know that in some communities, there's been staff being taken on to sort of fill that role, and that can quite easily become quite an expensive part of trying to facilitate affordable housing. You mentioned the BC Nonprofit Housing Association has workshops and similar for assisting groups which haven't had a complex project before. I was wondering if you're aware of any mentorship or communities of practice that exist where we have many different entities involved in developing housing, some which have done complex work here. And if there's a way of folks assisting each other within that community so as to be getting advice from people who've literally been there and done it, and also trying to reduce kind of the cost burden for staffing. So I was wondering if you could just speak to how viable that is as a fairly low cost way of providing that support for project management.
Certainly happy to speak to that. So BC nonprofit has been a leader in the Ready, Set, Build or Rebuild projects, and actually the models that were created for the similar type program in Ontario were modeled after the BC experience, because there's been a significant amount of work done in that area. So certainly in our discussion with the CEO, there is an ability to adapt programs to work within a community where you can offer workshops where you bring folks together with varying degrees of experience to go through exercises that help to identify the state, their capacity, what that looks like, set kind of a foundation of what the standards should be, could be, to help enhance everyone's skills, and look at the opportunity then to match up the organizations who have some recent experience and others who are interested but not sure where to start. And what that looks like. So there's certainly recommendations that we'll be making related to that capacity building that can look at what exists currently within the community from the organizations that we have explored in our review and spoken with, as well as what some of the professional development skills are, tools that are available that could help complement that. As you said, as a fairly low investment, minimal resource contribution from the district to help get the capacity moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Certainly we can talk about that in greater detail later, but that's something that support is a cost-effective way of getting that. I also wanted to just speak briefly to the idea of working on older buildings, and I think it's a really interesting prospect. I also know that, as with older vehicles, there gets to be a point at which it's not cost effective in terms of time or money to keep putting further resources into that. This may be kind of too granular, but are you aware of any studies out there which look into sort of the comparative cost per sort of per unit developed of one versus the other, or is it just simply too context specific?
No, there are studies that have been completed that look at what we would refer to as retrofitting existing buildings, and that's whether you're taking over an existing rental building to preserve it, as has been mentioned, at a lower level of rent to ensure that that housing is preserved and it's not renovated and then the cost of rent goes up. To modernize it, so to speak. And there's also examples and work that has been done through cost consultants related to renovations and retrofit of other buildings, commercial, schools, community centers, faith communities or churches, those types of things as well. So there is information. We're intending to be putting some financial information in the final report. We can certainly profile some of those as examples in terms of what the cost might be. If the interest is to be focusing not just on the new non-market, but the preservation of or the new that's created, not just from grounds up development, but perhaps retrofitting buildings. So there are some cost savings. Just have to ensure that the appropriate reviews are done of the buildings to understand what needs to happen and make sure that the appropriate zoning and planning is done to meet those needs.
Okay, that sounds really useful. So it sounds like based on a variety of different categories of buildings that studies have been done, and it may be fairly easy, easier than one might think, to triage initially and work out whether a building is best saved and retrofit or whether new construction is more affordable in that context. Okay, thanks. That's really useful to know. And I'll pass it back to Director Hilly, and then thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Chair. Couple of points on this same theme. First of all, I'm wondering, I'm mindful that we're 5 months away from a provincial election. We don't know whether we'll have the same government or a different one. But I'm wondering if the people working on this process have the capacity to sit down with BC Housing and talk to them in detail about some of these issues. A couple of reasons why I think that's a good idea. We're told that in the search, in the eventual decision to buy the Braidwood property, they looked at over 40 sites. And, you know, this was the best property that they could find that was available. But we have no idea what those other sites were, whether some of them might be suitable for other developments. You know, we've all heard the stories about why don't they build something on the old car lot and different things like that. And, you know, so again, it's a case of, do we have an inventory of the pieces of land, whether there's buildings on it or not, that have been looked at, what the status is of their availability for either building or redevelopment. The other thing I think we need to know is that they've changed what they're prepared to do over the years, because when we talked to them 5, 6, 7 years ago, they were totally not interested and not willing to build tiny homes or tiny home villages that they now have in fact built in Couch and Port Alberni and soon up in Kelowna. Similarly, I was approached when Transition Society was looking for a place to put a new purpose-built shelter and their programming. I was approached by a couple of people who had buildings that they wanted to sell and were willing to sell them for that purpose. And BC Housing was not interested. So I think we need to know if they are in fact interested. And if there's a possibility that, because I think if we go to our business community, there will be people out there who have properties and buildings that they may in fact be interested in selling for redevelopment. I mean, I have no idea who lives in the Arbutus Hotel these days, for one example, you know. But I think that's sort of direct contact with people who are in the professions and the business community, as well as BC Housing, to know what they're willing to fund would really be helpful as part of this process. Thanks.
I see, Allison. I think this is yours.
Thanks, Chair.
Oh, no, I need the seating chart clearly.
You can, yeah, okay, perfect. This is to Sue and to Courtney, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around some of the data and just wondering if they're saying the same thing. So Courtney, earlier you said that the region needs about 800 units a year, 350 units over the current build levels, but recognizing too that there's a deficit of 2,500 units, but 800 units here, 350 more than the current builds. And then Sue, you just mentioned 320 units are needed annually. So does the 800 units that you talked about, Courtney, include those 320 units that Sue talked about? So are we looking at, I'm just trying to get a scale of the annual need, which would mean something around 350 units a year.
I can speak a little bit to that. So the 320 affordable are included in the 800 total. And so what those 300 total are based on your income distribution in the community, it's estimated that about 40% of your residents need units that are priced below your average market rent right now, or what would be considered your non-market rental housing. So that's that 320. But to meet the full demands, including what can be met by the market easily, that includes, like, that's the full 800. And then the 350 is really just the difference between the levels of development that have been occurring in the community to the full levels of development that are projected moving forward. But the 320 is specific to the subset that would be priced below market rents.
Thank you. So just as a very rough, and I totally appreciate these are estimates, was it as a rough estimate, you need to be producing 350 units annually going forward, not acknowledging the deficit that you're in already. So that would be a fair.
Yeah, I think the 320 is what you'd need moving forward, probably like including that deficit for just the affordable component.
Right. Oh,
or
it's
just the
non-market.
non-market component. Yeah.
Right. So the 800 units that you spoke about earlier, that's 800 units of non-market affordable housing?
No, sorry, that's all your housing supply.
All your housing,
So
okay.
your private market, that's, you know, being
Yeah,
met for your
okay.
higher income needs as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for clarifying that, and Director Arbor.
Yeah, I'll join the comment I was gonna make to that one. It's, you know, it's an insane number considering where we're sitting right now. And I think when Dr. Grant and Dr. Grief talked about how intimidating that is to think that we'll come anywhere near meeting that demand, especially when we have a real lack of land in the Comox Valley. We're a pretty small area. And so the thoughts I was going to start talking about is, you know, I think when we talked last year, Dr. McCollum, myself, some others were really pushing for creating internal capacity at local government, right? Not like having a housing corporation, like looking at what this, which I think we'll talk about later, what the CRD has done, what other places have done, because we are going to lose. I went to see the Whitecaps against Miami last weekend, and their B team, like we felt like we never had a chance against their B team. And we're competing against the development sector. So when Dr. Hillian talked about the empty car lot, every developer has already ran some numbers on that. We haven't. Like, we're getting smoked out of the water every day for every piece of land on the valley because we don't have the staff capacity or expertise to compete to try to secure properties. And that's what I want if we're going to make it this. And I'm tired of waiting for BC Housing. We've been in BC. We've had a very generous government that produced a housing plan in 2018. And that has kept us at 50 affordable units. So we're not doing it, even with all the resources, and their processes are slow. As we know, on Hornby, I'm 6 years after approvals to build 20 units on the BC Housing development, 6 years after their approval and grant funding. So if we're going to win, I think we need to have a vehicle that can compete with the development community, can look at that apartment building and say, let's do it. And develop a business plan that is not solely reliant on the province and the federal government dollars, that they are savvy, competent, and that they can go to toe with the development community. Otherwise, we'll be talking in 10 years about how we need 350 units a year before. By then it'll be 500, and then we'll still be at 50, in my opinion.
All right, thanks very much. And Sue, I know you still have another half of your slideshow to present.
okay.
So maybe it's good to see where the questions have died out, but I'll just pass it back to you, please.
Great, thanks so much. Great discussion, and this has really been helpful. It's a complex issue, so being clear on what the roles are and what the opportunities are is important. And then I'm going to move into now talking about, we've talked a little bit about the what needs to be done. We're going to talk a little bit about the how you might be able to accomplish that. There's a lot of information kind of packed into these slides, and I know it's a lot to take in. The intention today is to really just have a preliminary discussion, provide a little snapshot and some examples to you. And our final report will have a lot more background information on the various examples and best practices that exist largely across the country, and what some of the challenges might have been with them. And we will be providing recommendations that will look at staging. There could be some phasing. It's not about picking an action. There may be many actions that you choose to take, and they may be phased over time because there may be things that are a faster, like a quick win. Some things take a little longer to set up in terms of structure, as Councillor has just mentioned, but we can certainly flesh that out in the report. So with respect to opportunities, and risks and requirements for direct development versus assistance to nonprofits. So this is just intended to be a quick snapshot to say, you know, there are two options. There is an option of developing non-market housing directly as a regional district, and there's an option to provide one or more forms of assistance or partnering with nonprofits to facilitate development. There's also the third option is doing both. to varying degrees or within parameters. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But just to start off, I thought we'll just talk a little bit about what are the kind of the benefits and challenges of both approaches, what's the kind of risk level, because we will be fleshing that out in the final report that talks about the risk and the financial requirements and what implementation would look like. So with respect to developing non-market housing directly, some of the benefits are that it allows you to have greater control over what's happening, including the time and speed with which you act. It does provide consistent project management and a high degree of accountability to the local community. Some of the challenges are that it does require financial and human resource commitments. There are some potential hurdles due to procedural requirements. So it's important when you're looking at what type of entity you might set up, that you're looking at how quickly you want to be able to make decisions, who has the authority to make decisions, and what that looks like. The district will assume in that kind of an approach a higher level of risk, certainly because you're managing that yourself, and there may be a perceived competition with nonprofits for what is considered to be a limited amount of funding from senior levels of government. There are certainly ways to manage that in terms of activities that could occur in the lower section there to provide other types of supports and assistance to nonprofits, but also working in managing non-market housing directly. And there are communities who've also looked at partnerships where managing the development directly, there are some relationships that I'll talk a little bit about where you manage the development process and then you have an agreement perhaps for a not-for-profit to operate and manage a site for you. So there are partnership approaches as well that I'll speak about. With respect to developing the non-market housing directly, the financial risk, you do assume the risks in those areas. Certainly there isn't currently operational experience within the district itself. Alignment, there can be some changes in priorities and impact longer term direction and funding. And then the financial requirements upfront, they are fairly high in that you have to commit some resources and funding to get it established. And there are some administrative resources that would have to be committed. But that all supports the benefits of having some control and influence and a higher degree of accountability and hopefully delivering results more quickly. With respect to providing one or more forms of assistance, and I'm going to detail some of those in the coming slides, to partner organizations, the benefits are leveraging the expertise that exists within the community with not-for-profits, and that includes co-ops. And they have the ability to leverage donations to a degree that an entity within the corporation wouldn't, unless it was arm's length and established in a certain manner. And there's some more flexibility for them in terms of some of the actions they might take. Some of the drawbacks are that there's less control over the development process and the outcomes from the district's perspective, and project management practices do vary. So sometimes there's concerns on how that is managed and the timelines with which projects come to fruition. And it requires really effective coordination with community groups as well as with local government. Financial risk, the nonprofits rely on less committed funding sources, which can impact the project viability. It makes it a little riskier for them, which in turn can sometimes fall back on municipal governments to provide additional supports. From an operational perspective, there's variability in capacity with not-for-profits, but certainly that can be supported in other ways. And then the alignment risk, there is a potential for misalignment between the priorities that the district has established and what the nonprofits do feel the priorities should be. And then under financial requirement, it can vary in terms of requirements for support can be medium to high from the district in order to support them to get things started. But there's low administrative practices to some degree in working with those not-profit organizations. With respect to the direct development options and the opportunities, risks, and requirements, I've only listed one example for each, but there are many that we can speak to, and we will have a number of them in the final report. So development within a CVRD, a departmental structure for internal management of supporting the development of non-market housing. So one of the examples we'll speak to in the report is the City of London, who in Ontario, who actually created a housing development corporation a number of years ago, and recently within the last 3 years disbanded the corporation and pulled it inside. And one of the reasons for that was they wanted more control over the decisions that were being made with respect to the development projects, the locations, the priorities, et cetera. So in having an internal structure, you do have a high degree of accountability and control over what's occurring. You can leverage your internal resources for those back-end supports with respect to HRIT and some of the policies and procedures. Some of the challenges are sometimes there's bureaucratic inefficiencies. It does exist. And there might be constraints with internal capacity, but it can be built over time, certainly with supports. Of course, there's no option to hold charitable status to support fundraising. Risks are considered to be, I've listed them here, fairly medium and low in alignment because you're controlling what's occurring. The financial requirements, of course, are significant. They have to be committed to upfront. With respect to development through the establishment of a separate entity with the district as a sole shareholder, so that could be a corporation similar to the Capital Region Housing Corporation. There's a balance of control and flexibility. You can still leverage some of your internal resourcing and supports. It does require effective governance to ensure alignment and management of the operational risk, because even though it's at arm's length, you are the sole shareholder. So ensuring there's governance structures in place and policies and procedures is important. The financial risk, similar to whether it's a departmental structure or essentially medium to low. And the financial risk, again, there's a commitment of internal resources and supports required. And then development through the establishment of an independent not-for-profit entity, similar to the Whistler Housing Authority. The benefits is they have a high degree of operational flexibility and there's strong community participation. So you do leverage those resources and expertise in the community. The challenges are the alignment and financial risk do exist with that, and it can be a lengthy process to establish the structure. So for some of these organizations, for example, the Squamish Authority Society will speak about, they're 3 years in and haven't developed a unit yet because it's taken that long to develop the structure. With respect to risks, the financial risk can be fairly high for them because it's not intended to necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have the financial backing or support that might be needed. And there are some requirements for some upfront resource commitments and support that is often expected to be provided through government organizations for the establishment of it. With respect to the options to provide additional early resources and their opportunities and risks, a few of these we've spoken about on the following slides in the discussion we've just had about the roles. Providing no cost or below market land, and it's been mentioned there isn't a lot, might be some, but there isn't a lot. Certainly currently there's a potential structure that exists at the district with the ESS program that is already established to acquire land. And another example would be the city of Burnaby. Some of the benefits of that are reduced direct operational involvement, but it can be managed through agreements, and the cons are there's a little less control over how quickly and efficiently the project progresses after land transfer. So usually that is addressed through agreements, but of course then if it's not progressing, then there's a push and pull that does occur. And then the risks here from perspective financial, operational, and alignment are fairly low, but the financial commitments are medium to low because there is some expectation that acquiring the land or providing the land that might be surplus at a low cost can be a significant contribution. Providing forgivable loans or grants to support pre-construction activities. That's what I mentioned with respect to even some of the training that could be provided. Currently, the Homelessness Support Services, HSS, is a structure that does exist at the district that could be accessed in this area and expanded perhaps in terms of mandate. An example is the City of Vancouver has a community housing incentive program. And the benefit there is it can mitigate some risk of project failure by ensuring that the organizations in the community have the resources they need for effective planning to get to that state of readiness to be able to apply for the additional funding to proceed with construction. And you can tie those disbursements to specific milestones over time once they achieve deliverables. There's a bit of a risk if the loan's not repaid or the conditions aren't met, but certainly can be mitigated in some degree through the agreements. And the risks there are medium to high financially, but medium to low with respect to operational pieces. Financial requirements, it does require and depend on the level of funding that's available. And that would, of course, depend on the land value in terms of whether they own land themselves already, or they're looking at expanding on lands with projects that already exist, which is certainly a benefit in adding units. And then with respect to options to identify, assess and secure land and the opportunities and risks that exist there, you can consider looking at developing a land infrastructure plan for available sites. An example here that we'll speak about is Niagara region, which is in Ontario, as well as Peel region. And that's the development of a master housing strategy that's been mentioned in the discussions today. It's identifying what sites are available across the district that might be available and what would they be suitable for. Where could that housing be? Some communities have looked at, public work sites and carving off portions of the land to contribute to housing. And that could be for both the district to develop or for a not-for-profit to develop, but having an infrastructure plan that lays out what's available so that when funding is available, you're in a heightened level of readiness in terms of how to proceed. Fairly low risk and low commitments financially to have that developed, and does bring together all of the various municipalities in that activity. And then the purchasing of land and RFPing for development of the land. And there's ways in which that can be managed, the transferring of the ownership to a not-for-profit that would develop the land, as I mentioned. And there have been some projects in Comox Valley that have been developed with municipal land. It's a fairly simple transaction. There is some concern sometimes of a loss of control or potential misuse, but can certainly be managed through the agreements and the funding agreements that are established for the provision of the land. There are communities that have looked at land leases with a not-profit that will help them with the development process. Burnaby has a city lands program. They retain control then over the land because they own it, but it does require them to have some administration supports provided to manage that. And then the third would be transferring land to a separate entity. And that could be something like a community land trust could be created in the community for the provision of land. And an example we'll speak about is the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust in Toronto that has been quite successful. And they have taken on the role as a long-term steward of land, so that community citizens organizations, a few of the directors have mentioned, they've been approached by groups. They could donate their land as a contribution to a land trust that has a responsibility then for management of that land for the purposes of non-market affordable housing, and then has agreements with organizations who would develop on it and then provide the provision of it. It's a bit of a complex structure to set up, and there's some shared control there, and it can be a bit lengthy, but it is certainly helpful where there is considered to be capacity for the provision of land from other organizations, and to have a bit of an incentive for them to do that. And we'll talk in much more detail in the final report on these items. So I'm just kind of at a very high level going through these. And then options to, which one am I on? Options to provide supports to nonprofits and their opportunities to managing the risks there. So providing guidance to nonprofits as an internal staff role. So many municipalities, including City of Toronto, has a very large not a very large, but it has a affordable housing office, large in consideration of other municipalities across the country. But they have remained in control of the funding and support. So they manage the relationships with the not-for-profit organizations, the distribution of funding. They provide some expertise support, project management, step in and support if there's challenges with development. And it does require staff with expertise, and that certainly is a challenge sometimes finding those resources. And the scope and scale of support, it can be limited by their staff capacity, and there are ongoing costs with that. But it does lessen a financial risk to a medium level, and the requirements up front are medium in terms of directing activities and funding from senior levels of government to those community organizations. So their role would be supporting those not-for-profits with the funding applications, perhaps providing some grants and managing those grants through that office, that team. It's called an office, but essentially a team, and assisting with applications to proceed with the development of housing. And then the second would be funding and or contracting a third party to provide guidance. And I apologize, the example isn't there, but there is an organization in Ottawa called CADCO that does provide some specialized service and support in these areas, and it's easier for them to scale. They're kind of like a development consultant, but an organization, but essentially you can contract with a third party consultant to support with that, who is funded to help an organization with an identified need to develop the funding applications, proceed with that, and then provide some support and oversight as they establish an RFPs and contract with developers to ensure that your funding and support helps them to achieve the milestone of creating the housing and to provide the expertise that's needed. It doesn't have to be an internal staff, it can be an external. The financial risk is fairly low. With that kind of a model, it's medium to low, and the requirements are fairly low in terms of helping to facilitate. So it doesn't require you to set up a corporation, but immediately provide some funding for the expertise to be supporting the not-for-profits that perhaps come forward and identify they have land, or matching them with surplus land, and they then would be take ownership of the building and operate it once completed. And then the other would be providing guidance as part of a separate entity established by CVRD, which could be the example of Squamish Community Housing Society, where their sole focus is on supporting non-market housing development. And they're fairly independent, which can increase their flexibility and can provide some long-term support. They're complex to establish and set up as a separate entity. So that is just one of the challenges. It does take a bit of time. So sometimes organizations have considered, if they're going to go down that path, doing other things at the same time to enhance some momentum and leverage supports already existing, and then coordinating. The financial and operational and alignment risks there are medium. Financial requirement, there is a significant financial requirement up front to help them get started. They need an infusion of funding for both setting up the society and the process that exists, and then the resourcing to get it started. But in the end, the administrative supports that are required are fairly low. And then lastly, the options to increase capital funding and opportunities and risks. There could be the delivery of capital funding through an external entity based on a plan with annual approvals by the board, whether that is an external organization that's established or through a not-profit, et cetera. You do have an existing structure with HSS that could accommodate with funding support. The benefits of that is the community is participating and involved. Some challenges are it's a bit more complex in terms of the governance and how you manage that when it's external, and sometimes can be a little bit slower in decisions, but it does require some administrative support and resources, so something that has to be considered. The risks are considered to be medium, and the financial requirements can vary, but can be medium to high depending upon what the outcomes are that are identified, what you're looking for in terms of deliverables, but ongoing administration supports would be lower because there'd be funding provided to an external entity to deliver the results. You can consider looking at maintaining a reserve fund to deliver capital funding. based on staff recommendations and board approval. So some organizations have focused on establishing a reserve fund like the Victoria Housing Reserve Fund, which allows for a more responsive and timely allocation of funds as perhaps land becomes available, other funding streams are announced, or opportunities are there to move a project quickly through shovel readiness. And it does simplify the administrative process by having a reserve fund with your policies around it that allows staff to make decisions, to make recommendations to the board for approval. The challenges are sometimes it's less strategic because you're responding on opportunities that arise and not necessarily developing a long-term map for an investments related to housing infrastructure, but it does help you to deliver funding more quickly. It does require some staff expertise inside and less formal oversight. The risks are considered medium, and upfront financial can vary medium to high, but administration is considered to be fairly low because your staff are, you're accommodating it within your staffing model and responsibilities. And then establishing alternative financing tools such as impact bonds. So there are some organizations who have developed this, which is leveraging private capital, looking at innovative practices. So we'll have some detailed information in the final report on this option. It's a complex structure to set up, and there are some market risks with it, but this is something in some communities with local champions, maybe from business communities and organizations who have decided that this is a way they can help contribute by having community members be contributing to a bond that then supports the acquisition of land or the development. And the risks up front, financial risk commitments up front are fairly high, but in terms of risks ongoing, they're medium from a financial perspective. The operational piece is a little higher, but alignment is certainly managed internally. So I've spoken very quickly and covered a lot of data, but I was hoping we could get some questions or feedback from you on any of those areas before I wrap up with the next steps.
Thanks, Sue. I don't think there's me any problem generating questions. Maybe I'll just lead off briefly because there are no lights on at this moment. I'll say I found your review of the number of different models really, really interesting, and the chart was extremely helpful. I know this is preliminary and high level, but an additional column I would love to see in the final report would be regarding impact and effectiveness. I'm not sure what the metric might be. It might be dollars spent per unit constructed would be useful. I think your observation about Squamish, for example, which I think you said is 3 years in with a 200K plus annual budget and hasn't produced a unit yet. I realize there's you know, initial setup costs, but that's an extremely important piece of information as one considers the relative utility of each of these points. And even within different models, like I was quite curious about between some of the housing authorities that Whistler was founded in 1997, has produced 1,900 units with over 7,000 beds. And Tofino was founded in 2005 and has produced 7 houses and 30 rental units. And it would be interesting to tease out some of the, again, effectiveness. What was the dollars per unit in each case, and what were the variables between the, say, those 2 housing authority models? But anyway, those are just a couple of initial comments. I see some lights on. Right. And I don't know if you had any response immediately, but otherwise I can go to directors.
Yeah. I can just add that certainly looking at the impact and effectiveness will certainly include that. One of the intentions is to be looking at packages of recommendations that help you to achieve varying levels of outcomes. I think that's an important part. But looking at in the best practices, the effectiveness of them and what the impact they've had to date is important. It's a key part of it. Sometimes they sound great, but then when you add in the information about what they've been able to achieve over what period of time, then you question to yourself, is that going to leave us more frustrated as a community and organization? Or is it a rationale to perhaps go down multiple paths at the same time? And I think that's where we have to look at the short, medium, and long-term outcomes that you're looking for. Some may take longer, but it doesn't mean there aren't things that can't occur while that's happening as well, so that you're not necessarily putting all efforts in one area.
Okay, thanks. Well, I look forward to getting that more nuanced sort of report on effectiveness. That sounds
Great.
really helpful. I'll pass it on to see Director Arbor's got a slide on.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll support what Chair Cole Hamilton said around the impact, but I think in any event, we'll be disappointed because I think none of them have achieved a rate of 300 units a year, even at the size of Victoria, the city of Victoria. So, you know, I think we need to realize that everyone is struggling, and sometimes in those impact, if you can add some qualitative information, because sometimes political wins can change things. They can get starved with resources, then it goes back 4 years later. Like every story is going to be pretty unique. And I think in terms of Whistler, there was a huge private sector component to their success, which I can't fathom that we'll be able to replicate in this valley that is not a resort community. So yes, but this said, the way I'm thinking about it in terms of initial feedback, I know this is initial and there'll be more conversations, a lot more, but you know, in my simplistic head, I just think I like when you presented a bit of the hybrid option. I like the CRD personally. I've always have, because it balances investment, some form of control, but also a unit that can operate. And the way I think about it in terms of hybrid, if we've done 50 units per year through the coalition, like let's keep doing that. You know what I mean? And so now you create an entity who you charge with in the long term to create. So we have a need of 350. 50 will get covered through nonprofit societies, you know, just looking at the last 6 years. And then the mandate for this new unit is to aim for 300 and that kind of level of scale. In the short term, they might just underperform the nonprofit. They might generate 30 in their first year or whatnot. But for me, when it comes to the selection of vehicle, I really appreciated all the details you put in all the slides, because that will allow staff, yourselves, the consultants to do more analysis. But maybe I'm just stubborn. It's a year since we commissioned these sets of report, and what's happened today is I'm just like, yeah, I really like where we were in the conversation a year ago. And I want my housing corporation like CRD tomorrow, right? So maybe I'm just you know, the flaw of being of having a vision of what you'd like to see, but I'm you know, it was really nice that you opened our minds and educated us about all the different models. So that's really appreciated. Thanks.
And Director McCollum.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks for this. I also found the tables to be a very good starting point for kind of framing the direction that we want to go in, and just getting to I think it was the first table, just kind of teasing out the differences between going internally and partnering with the nonprofit sector that's doing some of this work already. And something that occurred to me in looking at the cons, that, you know, of course, you can't guess what people see the disadvantages of, but I think a real disadvantage to going with the strictly partnering with nonprofits is that it doesn't really allow us to build like a longer term framework and create something that increases over time and builds our internal capacity. It really is just looking for opportunities to present themselves and hoping that we can enable them. And if we're hoping to do 50 units this year and 75 the following, and I just don't see that there's a model there that we could expect to eventually reach these like 350 unit a year targets by going with a model that we're hoping that the nonprofit sector will magically increase their capacity just because they have a willing partner in the regional district. So I think that is a pretty big con for me personally. And then something that I would like to see come out of this is something that is forward facing to residents who need housing services. And that's another big advantage to me, is that centralization of a point where you're living precariously, or, you know, you're recognizing that maybe you're going from a couple to having a child and you need to, you know, plan for a bigger place. And if you have something like a housing corporation, like, I mean, I always go to the what the Capital Region has, because that's the one I'm most familiar with. But you know, they're managing wait lists. They're it's a pretty clear local government service that exists for people that need non-market housing. And we have many nonprofits that are doing great work here, but I don't really see that could possibly come out of doing a partnership model. And then finally, I have a question that's pretty specific to what we've seen in Courtenay over the last couple of years, that we have required the private sector to provide nonprofit or non-market units within private development. And then we've developed a housing agreement where they're required to provide those units at a certain rate, but it's really up to them. So there's not really like a formalized wait list, and it's kind of luck of the draw. I think if you happen to get one, and I mean, there's a pretty limited number. But could you speak to whether or not there is any kind of municipal or, you know, local government led work where they're providing a management, or at least overseeing the access to these non-market units that have been provided by something that's not nonprofit or government developed? Well, that's kind of a long-winded question, but I think you got what I'm saying here.
Through the chair, I'm happy to speak to that. So I've had experience in former roles working for municipalities in Ontario where the housing corporation we've managed had leases with private market unit owners to then have subleases, head leases with not-for-profit organizations for the provision of housing. It's often used with respect to supportive housing, and is often seen as a benefit when for the private sector, when an individual who's a current tenant perhaps maybe loses their housing, loses their job, their income levels drop, and allows them some stability to stay. So with varying rules and priorities established, you can manage that as a rent supplement. So there are organizations that do that, and they do that through a housing corporation or through a specific team established within a local government.
Great, that's good to hear. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. And I see staff about to dive in. And Sue, I was going to ask, in future, if people are asking about a specific slide, just because there's so much information on them, would you be able to just sit back to them when
I
they
certainly can. Sorry about that.
No problem at all.
Yeah.
Okay, and
Oh, I'm up. Thank you.
sorry, actually,
You bet.
she meant to flag Jake. Sorry
Oh.
about that.
Yeah, sorry. Just to follow up on that, my understanding is that is one of the core mandates of the Squamish Housing Society is to manage those wait lists and to help sort of coordinate and oversee the provision of those units. It was mentioned around, you know, Sue, I think, went into the length of time and the work and the investment required around that organization. I think that's what's really key about this conversation now and the future conversations. What is, you know, establishing role clarity? Because I think in a lot of cases there's a desire to do everything, and that can sometimes really challenge these resources or these entities with doing it all. So again, Squamish is a good example of, I think, performing that service, but perhaps also with expectations of doing other things too. And with essentially 1.5 staff, it's a challenge. So.
Director Brown, I think you're already live.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm going to suggest another action. Just building off the availability and matchmaking sort of theme. One of the things that's come up in Cumberland since the new short-term rental regulations came into effect is, you know, the resistance of people who have secondary suites or available units to rent long-term because they're afraid of a bad tenant. And so setting up, and I'm just wondering if this is being done anywhere, setting up a landlord tenant sort of rating tool where people can sign up as good tenants and landlords sign up as good landlords, and almost like a, you know, a super host function or something like that. We want to borrow from the short-term rental market for our own good. Yeah, just wondering if anyone's doing that out there to facilitate long-term rentals, or the turnover of short-term rentals specifically to long-term, or anything like that.
I can certainly chime in, and then Cassandra may have something to add. I am aware of organizations, both government and not-for-profit, who are working with respect to secondary units, not necessarily short-term rentals, but secondary units, to target individuals from wait lists and providing some incentive, attaching it to the incentive programs for the establishment of the safe second unit. So aligning it with the inspections and the grants. And some have actually stipulated that the expectation is that you, someone from a wait list would then be provided with the unit if it's created and it is managed at a below market rent level. And I am aware of some housing help centers that are managing the matching kind of housing registry functions in many areas across the country to ensure that some information and some relationships are built. And so it's not necessarily managed at the government level, but more at the not-for-profit agencies on the ground level. Cassandra, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add, building on that, that in terms of the identifying sort of good tenants or good landlords, an initiative that has come out of BC, the Rent Smart education, and is now being applied in many communities across Canada, and I think to some extent in Comox as well. They have a program that they encourage residents or prospective tenants to take. And once they take it, then they would get a certificate, which they could then present to the landlord to say, I have this education. And they're trying to also educate landlords to say, okay, they have this education on being a good tenant, trying to encourage landlords to accept that as being more likely to, you know, to have a good experience. And then likewise, there is a program for landlords that they could also be certified through the program. So there is that tool that is happening. The take up on the landlord side is somewhat lower in many communities, and I think it's still a process, work in progress in many communities to have more understanding of landlords of what that program offers and how it could be of value to them to accept tenants that have that education. At the same time, it can also present another barrier for those who aren't able to complete a program such as that, who just don't have that ability to attend multiple days and do that kind of a program. So.
Thanks so much. I actually had a question building on that as well. As I know that BC Housing has a subsidized housing, I'm trying to remember exactly what they call it, a single application point. But I was looking for the city of Courtenay, and it lists maybe a third of what I know to be the potential place one could find accommodation like that. So it's clearly incomplete, but attempting to fill that gap centrally. And I was just remembering that Lisa Moppet, you said that when you're talking about renting up, which I believe is the process of sort of finding tenants for buildings, I think you reported that the nonprofits were not having challenges with that. Was that based upon Comox Valley based nonprofit? I made a note of that. Perhaps I was. How did I make that note? The renting up. So renting up. Did you have any assessment of whether that is an ongoing challenge here in the Valley? I thought perhaps I'm misremembering.
I don't think that was in my presentation. I think Sue may have mentioned that.
Okay. Maybe those Courtney's. Okay. Or Sue's.
Yeah.
Sue, was
I
that
think-
yours? Sorry, I'm
Yes,
conflating my
sorry.
slides.
Yeah,
I
no,
apologize
it
for
was,
that.
it's okay. Yeah, I did mention it in terms of rent up. So an important part of the construction process is the moment you decide you're moving forward is you establish your process on is there an existing wait list in the community? Are you promoting the building and starting to establish the wait list? Once you determine who the core group is that you're intending to serve, is it targeted to seniors, supportive housing? What services will be provided so that there isn't a gap, and that part of that feasibility review and pre-development is ensuring you've done your homework to understand what the need is, where you're building, and who is of interest, and so that you ensure you're not developing something that there isn't the need for. So it's kind of part of an initial viability assessment, and then it informs at the end what you're leading to occupancy.
Okay, thanks. And I have one other question. I think at this point I'm leaning towards the sort of housing authority model still, but there was a model which I wasn't familiar with, the Victoria Housing Reserve Fund program, which seems sort of similar to the HSS function that we have now, but it's more policy bound, and it brings the decision making in-house. I'm just wondering whether you have any information on whether setting up a fund like that was effective in increasing the number of housing units, because I imagine even if you're providing partial funding, it's the larger government programs that are going to determine who needs partial funding to complete the project. So I'm wondering if a program like that, which seems to have fairly low administration overheads, how effective that was from sort of before it was established to after, to impacting unit construction.
So we can certainly address that in the final report. My understanding is that the reserve fund has been used to respond to immediate requests that help get them shovel ready to apply for the capital funding, and that the process of establishing a reserve fund is intended to have funding available that's been budgeted and that staff are able to manage. But we'll certainly ask some further questions to get some details on their program to make sure that's in the final report.
Great,
I
thank
can
you.
speak a little bit further to that as well. Just so theirs is in this case, which isn't the case in all housing reserve funds, but in their case, theirs is a fairly shallow grant, a little bit similar to HSS currently. The maximum that they provide is about 25,000 per unit for those units that are intended to serve households that require deep subsidies. So it is one in their case that they do still need to tack on a fair bit of senior government funding. But we certainly have seen in some communities that have used it in a more significant way to really get units off the ground quicker.
Thank you. I think I took a look at it last night. It seems, although it's perhaps a low amount per unit, I think the total possibility, they recently raised the cap to over 500,000. So it's, you're chipping away at a very large amount, but that could be a substantial contribution. And I see Director Kerr, and I know we have lunch coming, so I'll perhaps pass it over to you and stop talking.
Perfect. Well, I won't take longer than 45 minutes for my comments. No, just a couple of quick things. I'm also leaning towards the housing authority model. I think the control that CVRD would maintain is really important. Also allows us to step on the gas and not rely on other partners to do the work. We could actually drive the work. I'm really interested in this social impact bond piece. The big issue is we don't have the money. Unless we raise taxes, we don't have the land. We don't have money to get the land. And that Director Arbour, your point, the developers will outbid us or outsmart us to get to the land first. So if we had the money, we could do that. Toronto just raised 235 million for a social impact bond, 4.55%, 20-year maturity. And we have many retirees in this community that would want a safe place to park their money. So we could have a social impact bond, raise the money, buy the land, build the housing, step on the gas, and put people in more homes.
All right, and Director McCollum, but thank you for the, I think you got agreement on lunch there for sure. Okay, there was another light, but that's all for now. I think that's the program for before lunch. So are we wrapped up, Allison? Is there?
Can we talk about how
Sorry.
long lunch could be? Could it be half an hour? Could it be
Oh.
40 minutes?
Yeah,
One
I
or
was,
two till 1 o'clock?
are you good? Is half an hour okay? So I'm not sure, we're, yeah, 12:45 and we'll get back. Yeah. Or I was gonna say 12:45, half an hour. I think if lunch is here, that will be sufficient, then we can
Oh, okay.
keep moving.
Takes half an hour to get into our bathroom.